SpongeBob has run for decades on the same 10 familiar faces, but buried in the show's own records are hundreds of characters who appeared exactly once and vanished. One voiced by a real film critic, another built from a 1922 horror movie corpse. In this video, we break down every one-time SpongeBob character, and it opens with a made-up name that turned out to be engraved on a real gravestone. Smitty Werbenjagerman Jensen. A yard sale in a cartoon town does not sound like the setting for one of the strangest characters in the history of the show, but that is exactly where this one begins. The episode is called One Crab's Trash, and it aired on February 22, 2002, tucked into the third season of a series that was still finding its footing as a genuine phenomenon. Mr. Krabs, always looking for a quick dollar, sets up a table of junk dressed up as fine antiques. Among the items he unloads that day is a plain soda drinking hat, the kind with two straws running down from little bottles on either side. He sells it to SpongeBob for almost nothing. Within minutes of the sale going through, a string of wealthy collectors shows up asking about that exact hat, and each one offers an amount of money that makes Mr. Krabs physically shake. The hat, it turns out, is rare. Mr. Krabs immediately regrets letting it go, and spends the rest of the episode trying every trick he can think of to get it back from SpongeBob, who has grown fond of it and refuses to give it up for a replacement. Out of ideas, and running low on patience, Mr. Krabs settles on the oldest trick in the book. Under cover of night, he draws a crude ghost on a sheet of paper, rigs it to a fishing pole, and dangles it outside SpongeBob's window to spook him into thinking the hat belongs to someone from beyond the grave. In the middle of inventing this fake haunting, Mr. Krabs needs a name for the ghost on the spot, and what comes out of his mouth is a long, tangled string of syllables that sounds made up because it is made up. He calls the ghost Smitty Werbenjagerman Jensen, and he tells SpongeBob that this Smitty was number one, plainly hoping the whole thing will scare SpongeBob into handing the hat over without asking too many questions. The plan lands, but not in the direction Mr. Krabs expected. SpongeBob does not just hand back the hat. He takes the ghost story seriously enough to track down an actual grave with that exact name carved into a tombstone shaped like the number one, out in a cemetery called Floater's Cemetery. He buries the hat there himself, treating the whole thing with total sincerity, the kind of earnest overcorrection that defines his character. When Mr. Krabs finds out his throwaway lie somehow matches a real grave in this world, he assumes it is nothing more than a strange coincidence and decides the money is worth the risk. He sneaks into the cemetery that night and digs the hat back out of the coffin himself. What he finds inside is not just an old hat resting on a skeleton. The skeleton sits up. It is wearing the hat, and it is not happy that someone has just dug open its grave and taken something off its body. The fish introduces itself in its own bony, half-detached way as the very same Smitty Werbenjagerman Jensen that Mr. Krabs invented out of thin air only hours earlier, and it wants its hat returned immediately. When Mr. Krabs refuses, Smitty responds by raising an entire army of undead fish out of the surrounding graves to settle the argument by force. Mr. Krabs fights his way through the horde using the jaw of a swordfish skeleton as an improvised weapon, eventually knocking Smitty back into the ground and reclaiming the hat, only to find out afterward that its value has completely collapsed because someone discovered an entire warehouse stacked with identical hats. The $1 million prize Mr. Krabs spent the whole episode chasing turns out to be worthless the moment he finally gets his hands back on it. Smitty appears in that one battle, delivers a handful of lines, and is never seen or mentioned again in any other episode of the series. By any normal measure, that should have been the end of the character, a minor gag buried in a season 3 episode among hundreds of other minor gags from the same era. Instead, something about that 15-second joke, a lie told to a talking sponge that somehow turns out to be literally true, took on a life completely separate from the episode that created it, and it kept growing for well over a decade after the fact. The character's afterlife did not start on television at all. It started, as so many things do now, in the strange, disorganized corners of the internet where old cartoon clips get passed around long after their original broadcast. Sources that have traced the spread of the joke point to a Yahoo Answers post from February of 2010, years after the episode originally aired, in which someone simply asked who Smitty Werbenjagerman Jensen was. That kind of question, earnest and slightly confused, is often the first visible sign that a piece of throwaway media is starting to detach itself from its source and take on a second life as an internet reference that people repeat without necessarily remembering where it came from. The following year, in April of 2011, a clip from the episode itself began circulating more widely on video sharing sites, centered specifically on the moment SpongeBob shouts out that Smitty was his hat and that he was number one. That single line, delivered with the kind of total emotional commitment that only a cartoon sponge can manage over something this trivial, became the seed of the meme in its most recognizable form. It is worth noting how strange this actually is. The line is not clever in any conventional sense. It is not a punchline built for repetition. It succeeds because of the sheer, unearned intensity behind it, a level of grief and outrage completely disproportionate to a soda hat, and that mismatch between the size of the emotion and the size of the object is exactly the kind of thing that spreads. From there, the joke kept climbing. By May of 2013, a dedicated page had been created specifically around the phrase, built entirely around the character and the line about being number one, and within roughly 2 years, that page had gathered more than 800,000 likes, a number that puts it well past the size of most dedicated fan communities built around actual main characters from the show, let alone a background skeleton who appears for less than a minute of screen time. Later that same year, one of the most widely watched gaming personalities online used the name Smitty Werbenjagerman Jensen as a label for another player he ran into inside a multiplayer survival game, a small moment that shows how completely the name had detached from its original cartoon context and become a kind of all-purpose joke name that people reached for in situations that had nothing to do with SpongeBob at all. By 2015, the character had been formally cataloged on one of the internet's largest repositories of meme history, treated as a documented cultural artifact with its own timeline of spread rather than simply a cartoon character. Fan art followed. Speed drawing videos followed. A title for one creator's video used the phrase outright as a kind of exclamation, borrowed wholesale from the original line. None of this activity involved the character appearing in a single additional episode of the show itself. Everything that kept the name alive happened entirely outside the cartoon, built and sustained by an audience that had, by that point, largely grown up and moved on from being the show's core demographic of young children, and was now revisiting old episodes with a different kind of attention, hunting for exactly this sort of strange, overlooked detail. There is a small, quiet irony sitting underneath all of this. The joke only works because of a detail buried in the writing that most viewers would never consciously register. When Mr. Krabs invents the name on the spot as part of his fake haunting, he is lying. He has no idea the name will later turn out to belong to an actual character with an actual grave. The show plays this as an accident of fate rather than something orchestrated, and that structure, a careless lie accidentally turning out to be true, is a very old kind of story device, one that shows up in folklore and ghost stories going back long before cartoons existed. SpongeBob simply dropped it into a 15-second aside inside a stronger episode about greed and grave robbing, and let it sit there without drawing attention to how unusual it actually was. The tombstone itself carries another small detail that fans have pointed to repeatedly over the years. Smitty's full name, when it appears carved into the stone in the episode, is actually missing a piece of the full mouthful that Mr. Krabs stumbles through earlier in the episode, a small inconsistency between the spoken version of the name and the version etched into the grave. It is the kind of tiny animation error that means nothing to a first-time viewer and everything to someone who has paused the frame and studied it closely, which is precisely the kind of scrutiny this character has received from the corners of the fan community that specialize in exactly this sort of detail. Different language versions of the episode handled the name in their own way, which says something about how far this joke traveled once the show went into international syndication. In the Croatian dub, the name was rebuilt out of several extremely common Croatian surnames stitched together, aiming for the same effect the English version has, a name so absurdly long and unfamiliar that it sounds like a joke on its own. The Hebrew dub did something similar, combining a handful of common Hebrew names into one long string. A Korean broadcast version translated the name into a description built from sea creatures instead, landing on something that reads roughly as whale, shark, seaweed, sorry, cutlass fish, trading the joke of an overly long human-sounding name for a joke about an overly long list of fish. Every one of these versions is chasing the same basic comedic shape the English version has, proving that the gag was strong enough as a piece of writing that translators across completely different languages kept reaching for versions of the same idea rather than cutting the joke or replacing it with something unrelated. What makes Smitty worth opening this whole video with is not the size of the character inside the show itself, because inside the show the character barely exists. It is the size of the gap between how small that role actually is and how large the character grew once it left the show entirely. Most one-time characters in this world stay exactly where they were placed, remembered by dedicated fans who keep detailed records of every appearance, mentioned once in a wiki entry and then left alone. Smitty broke out of that pattern completely, becoming one of the most widely recognized single-episode characters in the entire history of the franchise, despite having no presence anywhere else in it, no toy line, no follow-up joke, no acknowledgement from the writers that the character had become anything more than what was written in 2002. There is something almost poetic about the fact that the joke driving all of this attention is about being number one, a hollow boast in invented on the spot by a con artist crab, attached to a character who then spent over a decade actually earning that boast in a completely different arena than the one the joke was written for. Mr. Krabs lied about Smitty's importance to save himself the cost of a hat. The internet, working independently and years later, made that lie true in every practical sense that matters for a piece of media like this, turning a 15-second gag into one of the most referenced single scenes in the show's history. Before this video moves further into the roster of one-time characters scattered across the show's history, it is worth sitting for a moment on what Smitty represents as a category. Some one-time characters vanish because there was simply nothing more to say about them, a joke told once and complete. Smitty vanished from the show for that same reason. One scene, one purpose, no further plans. But the character refused to stay small once it reached an audience willing to keep passing it along, which is a reminder that the size of a role inside a story and the size of its life outside that story do not always match. A soda hat, a fake ghost, and a grave that turned out to be real were enough to build a piece of internet history that has outlasted plenty of characters the show actually planned to bring back. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A single lie about a soda hat turned into one of the most quoted scenes in the show's history, built entirely outside the episode that created it. Next comes a very different kind of one-time character, one voiced by a real film critic sitting inside a cartoon food review. Section 2. Gene Scallop. Some one-time characters in this show disappear because the writers simply had no reason to bring them back. A background gag gets its laugh, the episode moves on, and nobody thinks about it again. But every so often, a character shows up for one episode, and only later does the real reason for their existence become clear, tied to a person living outside the cartoon entirely, someone whose life story stretches back decades before Bikini Bottom existed at all. That is the case with a purple food critic named Gene Scallop, and to understand why he only shows up once, the story has to start with a man far away from the world of talking sponges. The episode in question is called The Krusty Sponge, and it aired as part of Season 5, confirmed to viewers ahead of time through an announcement that ran at the end of a previous episode called Sing a Song of Patrick in February of 2007. The premise is simple enough on paper. SpongeBob has spotted a note in his own employee hat reminding him that an important food critic is scheduled to visit the Krusty Krab that day, and the anxiety over that visit takes over the whole restaurant before the critic has even walked through the door. Squidward mocks the whole idea of worrying about a critic's opinion, which becomes one of the episode's small ironies, since Squidward himself spends other episodes fretting over what critics think of his own art. When the critic finally arrives, he introduces himself as Gene Scallop, a food reviewer for Bikini Bottom News who hosts a segment called Bottom Feeding. Squidward, true to form, treats him rudely almost the moment he steps through the door, nearly driving him out of the restaurant before Mr. Krabs manages to smooth things over. SpongeBob serves him a Krabby Patty, and the reaction on camera is the whole engine of the plot. Gene takes one bite, chews carefully, and delivers a verdict that ends up shaping the rest of the episode. He tells Bikini Bottom, live on the air, that the service at the Krusty Krab is close to unbearable, but that SpongeBob's cooking is good enough that the whole restaurant should, in his words, sponge itself out completely. Mr. Krabs, hearing an actual public endorsement of his restaurant's food, does not hear the criticism buried inside it. He hears free advertising, and he acts accordingly. Within a short amount of time, the entire Krusty Krab is rebuilt around a SpongeBob theme, rebranded as the Krusty Sponge, complete with a giant sponge-themed amusement ride called the Fun Train that loops customers around the dining room while SpongeBob drives it. Squidward is pulled off his usual job and forced into a full-body SpongeBob costume to serve as a walking mascot, a costume he cannot properly control, leading to one especially unfortunate moment where he accidentally slaps a young fan who wanted an autograph. Krabs, sensing an opportunity even in that disaster, offers to sign an autograph himself for $5, which only makes the boy angrier. The real trouble starts once Krabs, worried that a mascot accident might happen again, decides to keep SpongeBob out front driving the train and puts Squidward in the kitchen instead. Squidward, who has never had any interest in cooking and even less interest in doing it well, starts serving what the show calls spongy patties, meaning old, spoiled patties that have not been properly refrigerated. Customers start eating them, and within a very short stretch of screen time, the entire dining room turns into something closer to a zombie outbreak than a fast food rush, with sickened customers stumbling around the restaurant while SpongeBob tries to escape the chaos and warn Mr. Krabs, who refuses to open his office door because he is too busy affectionately handling stacks of cash from the day's unexpected profits. The consequence lands quickly and seriously for a show usually built around much smaller stakes. Mr. Krabs is arrested and put on trial for poisoning an entire restaurant full of customers, and this is where Gene Scallop's second and final function in the episode comes into play. He returns not as a critic delivering a review this time, but as the head of the jury, and it is Gene who delivers the verdict, finding Mr. Krabs guilty on every charge, which lines up with a small, dark joke buried earlier in the episode, implying that Gene himself had eaten one of the spoiled patties and suffered the same fate as every other victim in the courtroom. The trial resolves in typically absurd bikini bottom fashion, with the presiding judge turning out to be an unexpected SpongeBob fan who strikes a deal that spares Krabs from prison in exchange for one final ride on the fun train, personally driven by an exhausted, humiliated Squidward, and the episode ends with the restaurant quietly returning to normal. None of that plot, taken purely on its own terms, explains why this particular character deserves a place in a video about one-time characters over hundreds of other one-episode faces from the same era of the show. The reason sits entirely outside the cartoon, in the identity of the man who gave Gene Scallop his voice and, quite deliberately, his entire look. Gene Scallop was built as a direct caricature of a real person, a film and book critic named Gene Shalit, and the resemblance was not left to chance or subtlety. The character's design borrows almost every recognizable feature of the real man: the wild curly hair, the oversized round mustache, the large glasses, and a colorful bow tie, all translated into an underwater, purple-skinned version of the same look. Even the name plays on the connection in the most direct way possible, keeping the first name identical and swapping the surname for something aquatic. According to trivia included on the show's own Season 5 DVD release, the writers had even considered naming him Gene Shallots at one point, since shallots are also a kind of food, though not a seafood, before settling on scallop instead. The real Gene Shalit spent decades building the kind of career that made this parody instantly recognizable to a huge slice of the audience watching at home, particularly any parent sitting nearby while their kids watched the episode. Shalit worked for NBC's Today Show for close to 4 decades, starting there part-time in 1970 and becoming a regular, permanent fixture starting in January of 1973, a run that lasted until his retirement in November of 2010. Across that stretch, he built a reputation as one of American television's most recognizable film and book critics, known for a habit of leaning hard into puns during his reviews, something the writers clearly noticed and built directly into Gene Scallop's own dialogue in the episode, which is packed with the exact kind of groaning wordplay Shalit was known for on air: jokes about wanting to make like a banana and peel out of the restaurant, or insisting he was not just coffin when he compared the restaurant staff to livelier company found in a graveyard. Before his decades at Today, Shalit's career took a winding path that says a lot about how strange and varied a career in American media could be in the middle of the 20th century. He wrote for a long list of major publications over the years, including Look magazine, Ladies' Home Journal for a stretch of 12 years, Cosmopolitan, TV Guide, 17, Glamour, McCall's, and the New York Times, building a body of work as an arts and culture writer well before he became a fixture of morning television. Earlier still, in the early 1960s, Shalit worked as a press agent for the television personality Dick Clark, a relationship that reportedly ended abruptly during a congressional investigation into the payola practices common in the music industry at the time, after which Clark apparently never spoke to Shalit again and referred to him afterward, according to accounts from the period, in deeply unflattering terms. Shalit's reviewing style earned him a reputation of its own, a tendency to lean toward positive assessments and avoid harsh takedowns, a softness that made him accessible and popular with general audiences while drawing criticism from some of his peers in the profession for lacking a sharper critical edge, criticism that occasionally showed up in parody form from rival critics of the era known for a tougher, more combative style. That reputation for gentleness sits in an odd, almost funny contrast against Gene Scallop's actual review in the SpongeBob episode, which is far from gentle, packed with insults about the smell of the restaurant and the quality of the service, showing the writers were happy to hand the character teeth that the real man's public reputation did not always carry. Being turned into a cartoon fish was far from Shalit's only brush with parody culture over the course of his career, which is part of what makes his inclusion in this particular show feel less like an isolated novelty and more like one more entry in a long list. He had already been the subject of repeated parody on other animated series well before SpongeBob ever aired, appearing as a target of cutaway gags on Family Guy across several different episodes over the years. He had voiced a version of himself in 3 episodes of an earlier animated series called The Critic, playing on his own real profession. Decades before that, in 1975, a Muppet character built in his image appeared on an episode of The Muppet Show centered on satire of sex and violence in media. Live performers took on the role of impersonating him as well, including 2 separate appearances by John Lovitz on Saturday Night Live, followed later by 9 additional sketches montages, and weekend update segments featuring Horatio Sands doing the same impression, and separately, the actor Eugene Levy played a recurring version of Shalit on the Canadian sketch series SASCS TV. Even David Letterman got in on it, staging a bit on Late Night in which Shalit's head was comically squashed between two giant prop hammers during an interview segment. What sets the SpongeBob appearance apart from all of those other parodies is that Shalit did not just lend his likeness to this one, he actually voiced the character himself, stepping directly into the recording booth to perform Gene Scallop's lines in his own voice, which is part of why the episode still gets singled out today whenever people list his most memorable pop culture cameos. It marks one of the more unusual crossovers in the show's history, a moment where a genuine, decades-established American media personality walked into the world of Bikini Bottom in person rather than through a simple visual reference or a sound-alike performer. Gene Scallop's story inside the show does not end quite as cleanly as most one-time characters though, and this is where the label gets slightly complicated. The character technically returns in name in a later episode called Smartificial Intelligence, appearing again as the same food critic character. But Shalit himself did not come back to voice the role a second time. Instead, the character was voiced by Douglas Lawrence, a longtime writer on the show who has voiced a long list of other characters over the years, including Plankton, Potty the Parrot, and Larry the Lobster. Because of that gap, Gene Scallop as originally performed, the exact voice, the specific caricature built entirely around one real celebrity appearance, only exists in the single episode where Shalit himself sat down and recorded the part. Everything that came after belongs to a different performer wearing the same character's name and design, which is its own quiet reminder of how loosely the show sometimes treats the boundary of what counts as one appearance versus many, depending on whether the measure is the character's name or the specific voice behind it. There is a particular sadness that settles over this story now, one that did not exist for most of the years fans spent talking about this episode. Gene Shalit died on June 12, 2026, at the age of 100, a death that was reported in the days that followed as the passing of one of American television's most recognizable film and book critics, remembered for his decades on Today, his distinctive appearance, and the wordplay that defined so much of his on-air persona. His passing made him, according to accounts written in the aftermath, the first guest voice in the show's history to have lived to see their 100th birthday, an unusual milestone attached to a career that stretched from writing a humor column in a New Jersey high school newspaper all the way to a purple caricature of himself eating a rotten Krabby Patty on a children's cartoon. It leaves this particular one-time character sitting in a strange, quiet category of its own, inside the larger pattern this video is tracing. Some characters vanish after one appearance simply because the joke was finished and there was nothing left to say. Gene Scallop vanished, at least in his original form, because the man behind the voice moved on to other things, retired from his decades at Today, and eventually passed away, leaving behind a single episode that now stands as a small, permanent record of a real 90-plus-year-old broadcaster stepping briefly into a cartoon underwater town to deliver a string of puns about a burger joint, voiced in his own real voice, never to return in that same form again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A single episode preserved a real broadcaster's voice inside a cartoon fish who never came back in the same form. Next comes a very different kind of one-time character, a villain whose voice actor is far better known for a completely different role from a completely different decade. Section 3. The Tattletale Strangler. Not every character on this list vanished completely after their first appearance. Some got pulled back for a quick wave in a crowd scene, a cameo buried in a later episode, a face spotted for half a second among a group of prisoners or party guests. The character in this section belongs to that slightly more complicated category, a villain who got exactly one starring episode built entirely around him, and then spent the rest of his existence reduced to background material, glimpsed here and there but never given center stage again. His name, for as long as anyone in Bikini Bottom dares to say it out loud, is the Tattletale Strangler, and the story of how he ended up in the show says almost as much about the actor behind him as it does about the character himself. The episode that introduces him is called SpongeBob Meets the Strangler, and it aired in 2004 as part of a broadcast pairing alongside another episode called Pranks-A-Lot. The setup begins in a place familiar to anyone who has watched more than a handful of episodes of this show, with SpongeBob assigned to litter patrol outside the Krusty Krab. While patrolling, he spots someone dumping trash on the property, and being SpongeBob, he does exactly what his conscience tells him to do. He reports the litterer to the police. The man gets arrested on the spot, and it would have been a completely unremarkable, forgettable moment if not for what Squidward tells SpongeBob immediately afterward, once the police car has already pulled away with the culprit inside it. Squidward explains, with the kind of grim seriousness the show rarely gives him outside of a joke, exactly who SpongeBob SpongeBob has just turned in. This is the Tattletale Strangler, a notorious and genuinely feared criminal across all of Bikini Bottom, a man known specifically for one thing: he strangles anyone who reports him to the police. It is a threat built directly into his name and his entire identity as a character, and the show leans into just how seriously the town takes it. Even some of the toughest characters in Bikini Bottom, including the local motorcycle gang and Mr. Krabs himself, treat the mere idea of the Strangler with a level of dread that is unusual for a show this gentle in tone. SpongeBob naturally panics. The plot that follows plays out as an extended cat and mouse chase with a twist that reveals itself gradually. The Strangler, evidently strong enough to slip free of his handcuffs without much trouble, escapes custody almost immediately and sets his focus on getting revenge against the one person who ratted him out. Rather than attacking SpongeBob outright, he disguises himself with an obviously fake mustache and, in one of the show's more absurd bits of dramatic irony, presents himself to SpongeBob as a bodyguard for hire, offering to protect him from the very criminal he secretly is. SpongeBob, completely unaware, hires him on the spot. What follows stretches across most of the episode's runtime as a long, increasingly frustrating day for the disguised Strangler, who keeps looking for a private moment to finish the job, while SpongeBob unknowingly drags out every excuse imaginable to avoid ever being alone with him. Errands pile up. A trip to retrieve a house key turns into an ordeal that consumes more than 6 hours, at one point ending with SpongeBob accidentally jamming his own spiky athletic cleats directly into the Strangler's eye sockets while trying to climb into his own house. An injury played for slapstick laughs rather than anything darker. Once they finally do get inside, any chance the Strangler has of acting is repeatedly interrupted, first by one surprise party, and then by a second surprise party thrown in SpongeBob's honor, each one forcing the Strangler to wait out a room full of witnesses before he can try again. The episode's climax hinges on a case of mistaken identity that only makes sense within this show's specific logic. Patrick shows up at SpongeBob's house at exactly the wrong moment, and the increasingly worn-down Strangler, desperate to get him to leave so he can finally be alone with his target, snaps at Patrick in a way that convinces SpongeBob that Patrick himself must be the real Strangler. Patrick, being Patrick, does not argue the point and simply turns himself in to the police without protest. As SpongeBob keeps loudly insisting that his own best friend is a dangerous Strangler, the real Strangler finally reaches his breaking point, tears off his fake mustache in frustration, and reveals the truth. By that point, the exhaustion of the whole ordeal appears to have genuinely broken something in him, because rather than finishing what he set out to do, he simply wants to get as far away from SpongeBob as possible. The chase that follows ends with the Strangler willingly running straight into a jail cell just to escape SpongeBob's company, at which point the show delivers its final joke. His cellmate, waiting for him inside that cell, turns out to be Patrick, who had already turned himself in earlier and is still sitting there under the mistaken belief that he is the criminal everyone has been looking for. When Patrick, in a moment of complete sincerity, asks the real Strangler what he is in for, the episode ends on that note, leaving him trapped not with any sense of victory over SpongeBob, but with the exact same character he was trying to avoid. For a long stretch of the show's run, that single episode was the character's entire story, a self-contained villain built for one specific joke about a Strangler who never actually manages to strangle anyone on screen, undone entirely by an unrelenting wave of interruptions rather than any clever plan from the hero. But the Tattletale Strangler did not disappear completely the way many one-episode characters do. He turns up again years later in small, wordless capacities, glimpsed as one of several prisoners locked up during an episode called The Krusty Slammer, where Mr. Krabs briefly turns the Krusty Krab into a private jail. He shows up again as a guest, quietly milling around in the background of SpongeBob's birthday party in a later special, an appearance that implies, without ever directly stating it, that he has since been released from custody and has, remarkably, made some kind of peace with the sponge who got him arrested in the first place. He even turns up briefly auditioning alongside a lineup of other Bikini Bottom villains for a spot in a supervillain group, a scene that ends with him getting unceremoniously blasted into ash by a rival's laser weapon after losing his temper over being passed over for another one-time villain from this same list, a vampire named Nosferatu. None of those later cameos give him another word of meaningful dialogue or another storyline built around him. He exists in them purely as a recognizable face in a crowd, a small reward for attentive fans who remember his one real episode and enjoy spotting him tucked into the background of something else entirely. That pattern, one full episode followed by a string of silent cameo sightings, sets him apart from characters who vanish outright and never return in any form, and it says something about how this show's internal universe treats its own history. Nothing is ever fully thrown away. Characters get filed into a kind of permanent background roster, available available to be pulled out again for a wave, a nod, or a joke, even decades after their one moment in the spotlight has passed. The reason this particular villain earns a spot in this video comes down to the man who voiced him, because Thomas F. Wilson brought an entire second career's worth of villain experience into a 5-minute cartoon role that most viewers at the time likely never connected to anything outside the show itself. Wilson has spent decades as one of the more recognizable character actors of his generation, and virtually all of that recognition comes from a single, towering role that has nothing to do with talking sea creatures. He is best known, by a wide margin, for playing Biff Tannen across the entire Back to the Future film trilogy released between 1985 and 1990, along with 2 additional related characters in the same series, Biff's ancestor Buford Tannen and his grandson Griff Tannen, giving Wilson the rare distinction of having played 3 separate members of the same fictional family bloodline of bullies across one film series. Wilson's path to that role, and to acting in general, started well before Hollywood. He was born on April 15, 1959, in Philadelphia, and grew up nearby in Wayne, Pennsylvania. At Radnor High School, he threw himself into dramatic arts and served as president of the school's debate team, where, in one of those small historical footnotes that occasionally surface once someone becomes famous, his debate partner was a classmate who would go on to become a well-known columnist for the New York Times. Wilson also played tuba in his high school band and served as drum major of the marching band, a detail that sits at an almost comic distance from the towering, threatening bully roles that would eventually define his screen career. He went on to study international politics at Arizona State University before relocating to Los Angeles in 1981 to pursue acting seriously. Long after Back to the Future had already cemented his reputation, Wilson kept working steadily across television, film, voice acting, and eventually stand-up comedy and music as well. He played a supporting role as a coach on the Nickelodeon series Zoe 101 in 2005, showing up on the same network that carried SpongeBob itself. In 2009, he released a stand-up comedy special, along with a second comedy album. According to a 2012 report on his career, the character of Biff Tannen followed him everywhere he went in public life, to the point that fans would repeatedly ask him the exact same handful of questions about the films and his former co-stars, so often that Wilson eventually wrote and began performing an entire comedic song built specifically around the repetitive nature of those fan questions, turning decades of the same conversation into part of his stand-up act. Inside the world of SpongeBob specifically, the Tattletale Strangler was far from Wilson's only contribution. He became something of a go-to voice for the show's writers whenever they needed a physically intimidating, menacing villain to fill out an episode, lending his voice to Flats the Flounder, a bully character in the Season 3 episode The Bully, and later to a bouncer named Reg in an episode called No Weenies Allowed, one of the rare roles among his SpongeBob work that was not written as a villain at all. Outside the show, Wilson's voice work extended into other animated projects as well, including a role as a villain named Ashton Carnaby in Atlantis, Milo's Return, continuing a pattern where casting directors clearly leaned on the same low, rough vocal register that made Biff Tannen so memorable decades earlier. There is something almost fitting about the fact that a character built entirely around failing to complete his own threatening reputation, a strangler who spends his one starring episode getting interrupted by children's parties and stepped on with cleats rather than ever actually harming anyone, was voiced by an actor whose most iconic role was itself a bully who, across 3 different films and 3 different historical versions of the same family line, never actually won in the end either. Biff Tannen spends the Back to the Future trilogy losing to Marty McFly again and again across multiple timelines. The Tattletale Strangler spends his one SpongeBob episode losing to a sponge who does not even realize he is in danger for most of the runtime. Both characters carry an aura of real menace on the surface, voiced with total conviction by the same performer, while the story around them keeps quietly undercutting that menace at every turn. What makes The Strangler worth sitting with, more than a full decade after his single starring episode first aired, is exactly that gap between reputation and outcome. Squidward introduces him as one of the most feared criminals in the entire town, someone whose name alone makes hardened characters nervous. The episode itself never once shows him successfully strangling a single person on screen. Every attempt gets derailed by something small and mundane: a party, a set of house keys, a case of mistaken identity involving a starfish. He becomes a rare kind of one-time villain in this show's history, one who returns just often enough in quiet, wordless cameos to stay technically present in the show's ongoing universe, while never once being allowed to actually live up to the fear his name is supposed to inspire. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A villain built entirely around a threat he never manages to carry out was voiced by the same actor behind one of film history's most famous bullies. Next comes a character whose single appearance came from a completely different kind of collaboration, built not around a comedian or a critic, but around a piece of old horror cinema itself. Section 4. Nosferatu and the Ghost of Max Schreck. Every character covered so far in this video was invented from scratch for the show, built by writers sitting in a room, dreaming up a name and a face for a joke that needed one. This next character breaks that pattern completely, because he was never invented by anyone working on SpongeBob at all. He walked into Bikini Bottom already 80 years old, already dead in real life, and already one of the most quietly influential figures in the entire history of horror cinema, and almost nobody watching at the time had any idea just how much history had been smuggled into a 5-second cartoon gag. The episode is Graveyard Shift, and it aired on Nickelodeon in the United States on September 6, 2002, though it had actually reached audiences slightly earlier through a home video release the previous March. The setup is one of the more straightforward premises in the show's early run. Squidward is trying to leave work at the end of a normal day when a late customer shows up demanding to be served. Mr. Krabs, always alert to the smell of extra money, overhears the exchange and decides on the spot that the Krusty Krab should simply stay open all night from now on, leaving Squidward and SpongeBob stuck, working a full 24-hour shift together. Bored, irritated, and looking for a way to get some kind of entertainment out of the situation, Squidward decides to torment SpongeBob with a ghost story. He invents, on the spot, the legend of the hash-slinging slasher, a former Krusty Krab fry cook who accidentally sliced off his own hand, replaced it with a rusty spatula, and was later killed by a passing bus, only to be, according to the legend, unfairly fired from his job at his own funeral. Squidward tells SpongeBob that the slasher's ghost returns to haunt the restaurant every single Tuesday night, and that his presence is always announced by 3 specific warning signs. The restaurant phone rings with no one on the other end, the lights begin flickering on their own, and finally a silhouette matching the slasher's exact description steps off a late-arriving bus outside. What makes the episode work as comedy, rather than pure horror, is that every single one of Squidward's invented warning signs actually happens that same night, each with an explanation that turns out to be completely mundane once the characters actually investigate. The phone call turns out to belong to a nervous applicant who had tried calling ahead about a job and hung up before speaking. The silhouette stepping off the bus turns out to be that same applicant, a fish simply looking for work, matching the slasher's description purely by coincidence. Both of those explanations resolve cleanly, and the tension should, by any normal storytelling logic, have deflated completely at that point. It is the third warning sign, the flickering lights, that the episode leaves for its final punchline, and this is where the joke stops being an ordinary piece of cartoon logic and becomes something considerably stranger. When SpongeBob and Squidward finally track down the source of the flickering, the culprit turns out to be a genuine vampire standing by the light switch, playing with it purely for the fun of scaring them, and both characters react to him with a strange, matter-of-fact familiarity, as though there is nothing at all unusual about a vampire showing up in their kitchen. They refer to him, by name, as Nosferatu. That single word carries an enormous amount of buried history behind it, and almost none of it belongs to the character who says it. The actual creature standing in that final scene is not an original design drawn for the show at all. He is built directly from unaltered stock footage of an actual actor named Max Schreck, lifted from a real film called Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror, a German silent picture released in 1922, playing a character whose actual name within that original film was Count Orlok, not Nosferatu at all. The word Nosferatu was simply the title of the movie he appeared in, not the name of the character himself, a distinction the show's own writers were fully aware of and chose to ignore anyway because the word sounded funnier and more instantly recognizable when delivered in the sing-song tone the characters use. The person responsible for smuggling this piece of nearly century-old horror cinema into a children's cartoon was a writer and storyboard director on the episode named Jay Lender, and the story behind his decision, told years later in interviews, gives the whole gag a completely different weight. Lender explained that the ending originally had nothing to do with Count Orlok at all. The plan had been to reveal the source of the flickering lights as a brand new character invented specifically for the episode, a small creature living underneath the restaurant named Floorboard Harry. That version was eventually cut, and when Lender needed a replacement ending, he reached back into a very specific memory from his own childhood. Lender described growing up reading an old magazine called Famous Monsters of Filmland, a publication that covered classic horror and science fiction cinema for young fans who had no realistic way of actually watching most of the films being written about. He recalled seeing a still image from Nosferatu reprinted in that magazine repeatedly over the years, always the exact same photograph of Count Orlok standing in a doorway, without any accompanying context that explained where the image came from or what film it belonged to. Lender described his own first exposure to that image as a completely disconnected, out-of-context horror picture, something he recognized purely as an eerie visual with no attached story. When the moment came to invent a replacement joke for the end of Graveyard Shift, that same disjointed, context-free image was, in his own words, already sitting in exactly that slot in his memory, ready to be reused. Getting the actual image into the episode required Lender to search for a usable copy of the photograph himself, since the show had no ready access to archival stills of an 80-year-old German silent film sitting around the studio. He found a version of the image on the internet, at a point in the technology's history when the amount of material actually available online for a search like that was still extremely limited. Once the image was secured, an artist on the crew named Nick Jennings digitally altered the vampire's expression, editing in a wide, goofy, giddy smile to match a specific board drawing Lender had sketched for the scene, transforming what had originally been an image built entirely around dread into something built entirely around comic absurdity. Series creator Steven Hillenburg approved the idea after Lender pitched it to him, and Lender later described that decision as characteristic of how Hillenburg ran the writing room during that era of the show, giving his staff room to pursue ideas that seemed unusual or risky as long as they could successfully convince him the payoff was worth it. Lender has said that Hillenburg's willingness to greenlight strange, memorable swings like this one was part of what made those early years of the show distinct, a culture that rewarded writers for reaching for something odd rather than something safe. None of this history was visible to any child watching the episode when it aired, and that gap between what the joke looked like on screen and what it actually was became the real story over the following 2 decades. For a huge number of viewers who grew up watching this show, the Graveyard Shift ending became their very first exposure to Nosferatu in any form, encountered years or even decades before most of them would ever knowingly watch, or even hear about, the actual 1922 film the character came from. Lender himself has pointed out the strange symmetry in that outcome, noting that his own first encounter with the image of Count Orlok as a disconnected, unexplained horror photograph with no context attached ended up becoming an entire generation's first encounter with the same image, delivered through the exact same kind of disconnected, unexplained presentation, just filtered through a cartoon fast food restaurant instead of an old genre magazine. The reach of that single joke turned out to extend well beyond the fan communities who tracked this show closely. When filmmaker Robert Eggers directed his own high-profile theatrical remake of Nosferatu, released in December of 2024, he specifically credited the SpongeBob episode with helping introduce Count Orlok to younger audiences who otherwise would have had little to no exposure to the character before his film arrived in theaters. An unusually direct acknowledgement from a serious feature filmmaker of how much cultural groundwork a 5-second cartoon gag from 2 decades earlier had actually done. It is a genuinely rare thing for a joke built around unlicensed stock footage in a children's show to end up cited by name in coverage of a major studio horror release built around the exact same source material more than 20 years later. Graveyard Shift itself has aged into one of the most consistently praised entries in the entire history of the series. Multiple critics reviewing the show's DVD releases singled the episode out specifically for how well it balanced material genuinely unsettling enough to work as a scare for young viewers, with a punchline absurd enough to land as pure comedy for older ones. And more than one reviewer pointed to the Nosferatu reveal directly as the moment that pushes the episode from simply good into genuinely memorable, several specifically praising the choice to animate the vampire's expression into that goofy, giddy smile rather than leaving the original image untouched. Later retrospective rankings placed the episode among the very highest rated installments in the show's entire catalog according to audience scoring, and multiple entertainment outlets writing years afterward continued to rank it among the strongest episodes the series ever produced. Here is where the character's story takes its strangest turn, and where it stops fitting neatly into a video about characters who appear exactly once. Nosferatu, unlike almost every other figure in this video, did not stay a one-time gag. The character eventually returned as a genuine recurring figure across the show's later seasons and its spin-off material, turning up again in an episode called The Night Patty, where he is revealed to be the head manager running the Krusty Krab's night shift, and appearing repeatedly afterward across other episodes and an entire prequel series aimed at a younger version of the character called Kid Feratu. But there is a specific, meaningful difference separating that later, recurring Nosferatu from the one glimpsed at the end of Graveyard Shift, and it is the entire reason this character still belongs in a video about one-time appearances rather than disqualifying himself from it. The Nosferatu who appears in Graveyard Shift is not a drawn character voiced by a member of the cast at all. He is literal, unaltered archival footage of a real actor who had been dead for well over half a century by the time the episode aired, Max Schreck having died in 1936, 66 years before Graveyard Shift ever reached television. Every later appearance of the character across the show's history replaces that footage entirely with an animated design, voiced and performed by a different actor, Alexander Ward, giving audiences a version of the character built from scratch by the show's own artists, rather than lifted wholesale from someone else's century-old film. In that specific sense, the version of Nosferatu that appeared in 2002, built from real archival images of a real, long-deceased performer, appeared exactly once and was never used again in that form. Every version that followed shares his name and his basic vampire premise, but not his face, his footage, or his connection to an actual human being who once stood in front of a camera in the earliest years of narrative filmmaking and had absolutely no idea his image would eventually flicker a light switch in a fast food kitchen at the bottom of the ocean, 8 decades after his own death, introducing his own century-old face to millions of children who had no way of knowing they were looking at something real. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A single frame of century-old silent film footage became one generation's first encounter with a landmark horror character, borrowed once and never used in that exact form again. Next comes a character built the opposite way, entirely original to the show, but hired specifically because of a real killer hired for a real film role. Section 5. Dennis the Hitman. Not every voice actor who passed through Bikini Bottom for a single episode came from the world of television comedy or old horror cinema. Some arrived from a completely different corner of the entertainment industry altogether, a place built around tense thrillers, courtroom dramas, and the kind of roles that require an actor to make menace sound completely believable in only a handful of lines. That is exactly the territory Alec Baldwin was already famous for by the time he agreed to voice a single villain in the SpongeBob SquarePants movie, a character named Dennis, and the choice of casting turns out to explain almost everything about why the role works as well as it does. Dennis first appears roughly 2/3 of the way through the film, once SpongeBob and Patrick have already survived the deep, dark, dangerous, hazardous, and monster-infested trench that stands between them and the city called Shell City. Before Dennis ever crosses paths with the two heroes directly, the film takes time to establish exactly how dangerous he is through a short sequence that plays almost entirely for shock rather than laughs. Driving toward a gas station, Dennis is greeted by an attendant who makes an offhand joke about the size of his cowboy hat, asking whether it holds 10 gallons. Dennis responds by ripping the mouths clean off both attendants standing nearby, silencing them permanently before driving away without a word. A short while later, at a rough waterfront bar called the Thug Tug, Dennis blows a bubble in violation of the bar's strict policy against it, and when the owner steps in to object, Dennis knocks him out with a single punch hard enough to send him flying into the structure of the building itself, apparently killing him and sinking the entire bar in the process. By the time Dennis finally corners SpongeBob and Patrick near the outskirts of Shell City, the film has already made clear, through 2 separate scenes of casual, almost bored violence, exactly what kind of character the audience is dealing with. Dennis explains to them that he has been hired specifically to make sure they never reach their destination, having been sent by Plankton to intercept and eliminate them before they can retrieve King Neptune's stolen crown and clear Mr. Krabs of the theft Plankton actually committed. SpongeBob and Patrick, at this point in the story convinced they have become invincible thanks to fake seaweed mustaches given to them earlier by another character, laugh off the threat entirely, believing their new mustaches make them untouchable men. Dennis calmly proves otherwise by ripping the fake mustaches off their faces exactly as he had done to the gas station attendants earlier, then grows a real, full mustache of his own on the spot to demonstrate the difference, reducing their confidence to nothing in a matter of seconds. Cackling with obvious enjoyment at his job, he prepares to finish them off using the long spikes built into his boots, only to be crushed at the last possible second by an even larger boot belonging to a passing Cyclops, ending his run in the film in a single anticlimactic instant after building him up across the entire second half of the movie as its most physically dangerous threat. Small details scattered around the character reinforce just how far the filmmakers were willing to push his menace for what is technically still a family film. His motorcycle carries a license plate reading a blunt threat of violence spelled out phonetically. The sole of his boot carries a printed instruction telling a future victim exactly where to place their head. None of this is subtle, and none of it reads as accidental. Every visual detail attached to Dennis was clearly built with the specific intention of making him feel like a genuine predator dropped into a children's film rather than a cartoon villain built for laughs. And that intention lines up directly with why the filmmakers went looking for an actor like Alec Baldwin Baldwin to voice him in the first place, rather than turning to one of the show's regular cast of comedic voice performers who typically handle side characters. By 2004, when the SpongeBob SquarePants movie reached theaters, Baldwin had already spent close to 2 decades building a screen career defined by exactly the kind of coiled, controlled intensity that Dennis needed. He had appeared in The Hunt for Red October, playing a lead role in a tense Cold War submarine thriller, footage from which was later repurposed for the teaser trailer of a completely different, much later Baldwin project, a small detail that shows how thoroughly that particular performance stuck in the industry's memory over the years. He had also appeared in Glengarry Glen Ross, a film built almost entirely around sharp, aggressive dialogue delivered by desperate men under pressure, a performance still widely cited as one of the most memorable single scenes of Baldwin's career, despite running only a few minutes of total screen time. Years after voicing Dennis, Baldwin would go on to appear in the Mission Impossible franchise as well, continuing a pattern of roles built around authority, control, and quiet menace that stretched across his career both before and after his brief detour into Bikini Bottom. Baldwin's work outside of live-action thrillers adds another layer to why casting him as Dennis makes sense beyond simply borrowing his reputation for intensity. He had already built a substantial secondary career as a voice actor in animated family films well before this role, lending his voice to projects released by DreamWorks Animation, including an antagonist role in Madagascar, Escape to Africa, and a role in Rise of the Guardians. And he would go on afterward to voice the title character across an entire franchise built around the Boss Baby. That combination, a performer equally comfortable delivering quiet, controlled menace in serious adult dramas, and turning that same vocal control toward broad comedic or villainous roles in animated family films, is a fairly specific and unusual skill set, and it happens to be exactly what a character like Dennis requires. The role needs someone capable of sounding genuinely threatening for the benefit of any adult watching alongside their kids, while still landing every line as something a much younger audience can process as an over-the-top cartoon villain rather than something actually frightening. The character's short runtime in the finished film hides a surprising amount of missing material that never made it to any home release. According to accounts compiled by fans who have studied the film's production closely, there was apparently never a scene actually filmed or animated showing Plankton hiring Dennis in the first place, nor any scene depicting the two characters meeting directly on screen, despite Dennis's entire motivation in the story depending on that hire having taken place. Whether that connective material was written and later cut during editing, or simply never developed past the earliest planning stages of the film, remains unclear based on the information that has survived publicly, and no deleted version of either scene appears to have surfaced on any official disc release or broadcast cut of the movie in the years since. The result is a villain whose entire reason for existing in the story is explained entirely through dialogue delivered by other characters rather than shown directly, an odd structural gap for a character who otherwise received this much specific visual and vocal attention. Dennis's afterlife inside the franchise turned out to be almost non-existent, and what little of it exists comes with an important asterisk that matters for a video specifically about one-time characters. The version of Dennis voiced by Alec Baldwin appears only once, confined entirely to the 2004 film, and Baldwin has never returned to voice the character again in any subsequent SpongeBob project. A separate video game adaptation of the movie used a different voice actor, Fred Tatasciore, to perform the same role for that specific interactive release, since major film voice casts are not always brought back to record supplementary game dialogue. Years later, the character technically reappeared in name during a television episode called Captain Pipsqueak, but that later appearance used yet another voice actor, Clancy Brown, who is otherwise known throughout the franchise for his long-running role as Mr. Krabs, taking on Dennis as an entirely separate vocal performance disconnected from Baldwin's original portrayal. That pattern puts Dennis in a similar category to Nosferatu from earlier in this video, a character whose most famous, most heavily analyzed version is tied to one specific performance that never repeated, even though the name and the basic concept behind the character went on to get reused elsewhere by different performers. Fans discussing the character have specifically pointed out that this later cameo version of Dennis in Captain Pipsqueak should be treated as a separate performance from the original film villain, since the two portrayals share only a name and a rough visual design, rather than the same voice or the same specific menace that made the character memorable in the first place. In every meaningful sense that matters to the character's identity as originally conceived, the real Dennis, the one built specifically around Alec Baldwin's voice and his particular brand of controlled screen intensity, exists in exactly one film and nowhere else. There is a small, oddly fitting irony buried in how thoroughly the character has been forgotten by the franchise itself, despite ranking, by fan consensus, Dennis, among the more frequently discussed villains to ever appear in a single SpongeBob project. Some fan commentary has drawn direct comparisons between Dennis and Judge Doom, the villain from Who Framed Roger Rabbit, pointing to a long list of shared structural details between the two characters, including artificial devices hidden in their footwear used to enhance their physical threat, an all-black wardrobe suggesting some kind of official authority, and a specific type of buck-toothed cartoon prey that each villain spends their respective film hunting down. Whether that resemblance was ever a deliberate homage on the part of the SpongeBob filmmakers, or simply a coincidence born from two different creative teams reaching for similar villain archetypes decades apart, is not something that has been confirmed on the record by anyone who worked on the film, and it remains, at best, an observation made after the fact by attentive viewers rather than a documented piece of the film's actual production history. What makes Dennis worth including here, alongside vampires built from silent film footage and strangers voiced by actors famous for playing a completely different kind of bully, is the specific type of gap this casting choice reveals. The show and its film spin-offs have, across their entire history, repeatedly reached outside the ordinary pool of cartoon voice performers whenever a character needed to feel like it was carrying real weight from somewhere else, borrowing credibility, menace, or cultural recognition from actors, critics, and performers who built their reputations doing something else entirely. Gene Shalit brought decades of real film criticism into a 5-minute food review segment. Thomas F. Wilson brought an entire trilogy's worth of bully mythology into a villain who never manages to strangle anyone. Alec Baldwin brought roughly 2 decades of serious, dramatic screen menace, tested across submarine thrillers and desperate sales floor arguments, into a hitman who ultimately dies by getting stepped on by a bigger boot than his own, in a joke that lasts less than a second and undercuts every ounce of dread the film had spent building around him only moments earlier. That willingness to borrow real weight from outside the cartoon and then immediately deflate it for a punchline keeps showing up again and again across this show's history of one-time characters, and Dennis stands as one of its clearest, sharpest examples. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A hitman built specifically to feel like a real cinematic threat, voiced by an actor whose career was built on exactly that kind of menace, was undone in under a second by a joke bigger than he was. Next comes a character whose single appearance came wrapped inside a genuine, decades-old copyright dispute still unresolved by the time the show itself acknowledged it. Section 6, Kevin the Sea Cucumber and Jeffrey the Jellyfish. The episode is called I'm Your Biggest Fanatic, and it comes from Season 2. The premise starts at the Bikini Bottom Jellyfish Convention, a gathering that draws exactly the kind of enthusiastic, slightly obsessive crowd its name implies. The sort of niche hobbyist event that exists in the real world around everything from stamp collecting to model trains, translated here into an entire underwater subculture built around the specific pursuit of catching jellyfish. SpongeBob, already known throughout the show as someone with an intense personal passion for jellyfishing, one of the running threads that stretches across dozens of episodes and defines much of his free time away from the Krusty Krab, spots a figure he clearly idolizes standing among the convention crowd, a sea cucumber named Kevin. SpongeBob approaches him the way a starstruck fan approaches a celebrity, repeating his admiration over and over, calling himself Kevin's biggest fan, and the moment quickly escalates into something uncomfortable rather than sweet, since Kevin immediately senses an opportunity to exploit that devotion rather than appreciate it. Kevin, it turns out, leads a small jellyfishing club called the Jelly Spotters, presenting himself to the wider community as Bikini Bottom's premier jellyfish enthusiast, complete with a group of loyal followers referred to in the episode simply as the Anchovies, small background characters who function almost entirely as an unquestioning chorus, reinforcing whatever Kevin says or wants, never once pushing back against him, even as his behavior grows increasingly cruel over the course of the episode. When SpongeBob tells him he considers himself the group's biggest fan, Kevin tests exactly how far that devotion goes by ordering SpongeBob to jump off a nearby building, purely to see whether he will actually comply. SpongeBob does it without hesitation, landing hard enough that the fall sends him into cardiac arrest, requiring a defibrillator and the show's recurring background doctor character to revive him on the spot, a small detail the episode treats with the same breezy, consequence-free tone the show applies to almost every act of cartoon violence throughout its run. Rather than feeling any guilt over nearly killing an eager fan, Kevin is delighted by the discovery that he has found someone willing to do absolutely anything he asks, and he invites SpongeBob to join the Jelly Spotters, setting up what becomes the real engine of the episode. What follows is a long sequence of escalating, deliberately cruel initiation tests, each one designed by Kevin not to genuinely evaluate SpongeBob's jellyfishing skill, but simply to inflict pain on him for Kevin's own amusement, since every single test somehow ends with the jellyfish stinging Kevin himself instead of the intended target, deepening his frustration and his determination to make the tests progressively harder. The first test involves catching a single jellyfish, which immediately flies directly into SpongeBob's net without any real effort on his part, prompting Kevin to angrily kick the net in frustration, which only results in every jellyfish inside stinging him at once. Kevin responds by escalating the number of jellyfish required for the next test, first to 2, then to an outright absurd 20, each round ending the same way, with SpongeBob succeeding almost effortlessly and Kevin somehow suffering the consequences meant for someone else. SpongeBob passes every one of them anyway, no matter how absurd or physically dangerous, and Kevin's irritation builds until he finally announces what he frames as the ultimate final challenge, using SpongeBob himself as bait to lure and capture an actual queen jellyfish, the rarest and most prized catch in the entire hobby. After hours spent standing exhausted in the field waiting for a queen jellyfish to appear, one finally does, and it becomes clear that the whole test was rigged from the start. The queen jellyfish chasing SpongeBob turns out to be an elaborate robotic decoy, secretly built and operated by Kevin and his followers purely to humiliate him one final time and drive him out of the club for good. The plan collapses the moment a real, genuine king jellyfish shows up and becomes instantly infatuated with the fake robotic queen, mistaking the decoy for an actual mate and setting off a chase that terrifies both Kevin and the jelly spotters, none of whom have any idea how to handle the very creature their entire hobby is supposedly built around. A small but pointed piece of irony the episode never draws direct attention to, but leaves sitting there for anyone paying close attention. A club built entirely around the pursuit and admiration of jellyfish turns out to be staffed almost entirely by people who panic the moment an actual jellyfish, rather than a controlled decoy or a captured specimen, becomes an active threat rather than a passive object of collection. SpongeBob, despite everything Kevin has put him through across the episode, ends up being the only member of the group willing to step forward and confront the king jellyfish directly, calming him down with a bubble shaped like a pie, since the show establishes in this same episode that jellyfish of all kinds have an unexplainable weakness for pie, a detail that later gets echoed in other episodes across the show's run whenever a jellyfish-related crisis needs a quick, simple resolution. Even after saving the entire group from a very real threat, SpongeBob is still denied membership by Kevin on a technicality, since he never actually caught the queen jellyfish himself, given that the queen turned out to be a robot the whole time. That final act of pettiness finally turns the rest of the jelly spotters against their own leader, and the anchovies attempt to crown SpongeBob as their new leader in Kevin's place by tearing off his tentacle-covered head crown, though SpongeBob, having learned his lesson about the dangers of idolizing anyone this uncritically, declines the position and walks away from the club entirely, choosing instead to return to Patrick and process what the whole experience has taught him about hero worship. Kevin's design and personality were built by the show's writers with a specific, acknowledged source in mind, rather than invented from nothing. According to information the show's own creative team has shared about the episode, Kevin was conceived as a character loosely modeled on Melvin Sneedly, a smug, superior antagonist from the Captain Underpants series of children's graphic novels. A character known across that franchise for looking down on everyone around him while considering himself intellectually and socially superior. The specific personality traits carried over into Kevin line up closely with that source. The same air of smug condescension, the same instinct to belittle anyone beneath him in whatever social hierarchy he has decided matters, redirected here into the oddly specific world of competitive jellyfish enthusiasm rather than a school classroom. It is worth noting that both source and homage share a similar generational footprint, since Captain Underpants had already built a substantial readership among the exact age group watching SpongeBob by the time this episode aired, meaning a meaningful slice of the show's own young audience may well have recognized the resemblance in real time, long before any of the writers' later comments confirmed the connection publicly. Kevin's physical design reinforces the borrowed personality in small, deliberate ways. He is built to visually evoke an actual cucumber, colored a light, almost sickly green, with a crown-shaped cluster of pale yellow tentacles sitting on top of his head that resemble hair or a literal crown, depending on how a given scene chooses to frame him. An ambiguity the episode itself plays with directly, since it is that same crown of tentacles that gets physically torn off by his own followers during the episode's final act of rebellion against him. He wears blue-tinted glasses that obscure his eyes throughout most of the episode, a small design choice that keeps his expressions slightly harder to read and adds to the sense of him as someone performing a persona of effortless coolness, rather than someone genuinely comfortable in his own skin. Fans discussing the design later later on, have pointed to this detail specifically as reinforcing the character's insecurity. Someone who needs the trappings of leadership, the glasses, the followers, the club, the reputation, because he does not actually possess any confidence that would hold up without them. Kevin is not the only parody character folded into this particular episode, and the second one carries an entirely different kind of cultural weight behind it. Patrick, running his own smaller storyline alongside SpongeBob's throughout the episode, spends the entire runtime dragging around his own personal hero, a character named Jeffrey the Jellyfish, tied up and hauled behind him in a small wagon. Jeffrey barely speaks and does very little across the episode beyond simply existing as an object of Patrick's uncritical devotion, mirroring SpongeBob's own relationship with Kevin in a much smaller, quieter parallel plot. According to the same body of information the show's creative team has shared about the episode's construction, Jeffrey was built specifically as a parody of Barney, the enormously popular purple dinosaur character who anchored his own long-running children's television series and became, across the 1990s in particular, one of the most recognizable and most heavily merchandised children's characters in the entire country. A figure whose theme song and catchphrases had, by the time SpongeBob itself premiered, already become so ubiquitous among American children that a passing reference to him required almost no additional explanation for the joke to land with anyone even loosely familiar with children's television of that era. Putting those two parody characters side by side inside a single 15-minute episode says something specific about how comfortable this show has always been, borrowing directly from other pieces of children's media and repurposing them for its own jokes, provided the reference stayed loose enough and different enough in visual design to read as commentary rather than direct copying. Kevin is a sea cucumber, not a boy in glasses standing at a school chalkboard. Jeffrey is a small, mostly silent jellyfish riding in a wagon, not a towering purple dinosaur singing about friendship on a soundstage. Neither character borrows any actual copyrighted visual design, dialogue, or music from the property being referenced, and both function purely as behavioral parodies, built around personality traits and cultural associations, rather than any direct visual or musical lift from the source material itself. That distinction between parodying a well-known figure's personality and actually reproducing the protected creative elements that legally belong to someone else sits at the center of how parody has generally been allowed to function across children's television for decades. And this episode offers a clean, almost textbook example of exactly where that line gets drawn in practice. There is a specific structural cleverness in how the episode pairs these two parodies against each other through its two lead characters, rather than presenting either one in isolation. SpongeBob's relationship with Kevin plays out loudly and visibly across the episode's main plot, full of dramatic tests, public humiliation, and an eventual open confrontation that resolves the storyline directly. Patrick's relationship with Jeffrey, by contrast, sits almost entirely in the background, glimpsed only in brief visual gags scattered throughout the episode. Jeffrey silently present in scene after scene, tied up and dragged along wherever Patrick happens to go, never commented on directly by any other character until the episode's final joke calls attention to it explicitly. That structural choice lets the show deliver its actual thesis about the dangers of idol worship twice over, once through an active, escalating storyline that forces its lesson through direct confrontation, and once through a purely visual, almost silent repetition that never resolves at all, since Patrick shows no sign of having learned anything by the episode's end, still dragging his silent hero behind him in the very last shot. Kevin's story does not end quite as cleanly as a pure one-time character would, and it is worth being precise about that rather than overstating his obscurity. He returns briefly in small, minor capacities in later episodes, showing up in a background role in an episode called Jolly Lodgers, and again in one called Patrick the Mailman, and he goes on to become an actual ongoing character in the prequel spin-off series Camp Corral, which reimagines the core cast as children at a summer camp and gives Kevin a small recurring presence within that separate show's own continuity. His single major, plot-driving starring appearance, however, the version built specifically as the smug jellyfishing club leader who nearly kills his own biggest fan and refuses to admit he was wrong, even after being saved from real danger, belongs entirely to this one episode. Jeffrey the Jellyfish, by contrast, appears to belong far more cleanly to the one-time category, existing within this single episode as Patrick's silent, wagon-bound object of devotion, without the same pattern of later cameo appearances or spin-off inclusion that Kevin eventually picked up, a genuinely rare instance in this show's history of a character conceived, deployed, and retired within the boundaries of a single episode without ever being pulled back for even the smallest wordless cameo elsewhere. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that this show built two entirely separate parody characters into the same 15 minutes of television, each one aimed at a different corner of the broader landscape of children's entertainment. argument, one at a specific literary antagonist from a competing book series aimed at a similar age group, the other at arguably the single most recognizable and most commercially dominant children's television character of an entire preceding decade. SpongeBob itself, by the time this episode aired, was still relatively early in its own run, not yet the towering commercial institution it would eventually become, and there is a specific kind of confidence in a young show taking direct aim at both a rival book franchise and one of the most successful children's television properties in American history within the same episode, using both as raw material for a story about the dangers of idolizing anyone too completely. A lesson SpongeBob himself learns firsthand, and one Patrick, dragging his silent jellyfish hero behind him in a wagon until the episode's final joke, conspicuously never learns at all. It is worth noting that by the early 2000s, the specific cultural dominance the Barney franchise had enjoyed throughout the previous decade was already beginning to soften somewhat in the broader landscape of children's programming, meaning the joke embedded in Jeffrey's design may have carried a slightly different flavor for viewers watching in real time than it does now, functioning at the time less as a jab at something currently at the height of its popularity and more as a gentle, slightly nostalgic dig at a figure many of the show's older viewers and their parents would already have associated with an earlier chapter of children's television rather than the present one. What ties Kevin and Jeffrey back into the larger pattern running through this whole video is not a courtroom dispute or a licensing fight, since none exists here to report, but something quieter and in some ways more interesting. This show has repeatedly built its one-time characters out of raw material borrowed from somewhere else entirely, whether that borrowed material comes from a real film critic stepping into the recording booth himself, an 80-year-old strip of silent horror footage, a career built playing bullies in a completely different franchise, or, in this case, two entirely fictional children's media figures reshaped just enough to become new characters in their own right. Every one of those borrowings required the writers to walk a careful line between honoring or mocking the source clearly enough for the joke to land, while staying far enough away from it to remain something the show could actually call its own. Kevin and Jeffrey sit as one of the clearest, most deliberate examples of that balancing act in the entire history of the series. Two one-time characters built almost entirely out of borrowed cultural weight, deployed for a single episode, and then, in Jeffrey's case at least, never called upon again, left behind in a wagon at the edge of a jellyfish convention, a permanent, silent monument to exactly the kind of uncritical devotion the episode spent its entire runtime warning against. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Two parody characters built from opposite corners of children's entertainment shared a single episode and taught the same hard lesson about hero worship from two different angles. Next comes a character who never speaks a single word, appears for only a few seconds of screen time, and still became one of the most argued over faces in the entire history of the fandom. Section 7, Red Mist. Somewhere between 2010 and today, a piece of writing meant purely to frighten strangers on the internet found its way into an actual episode of the show it was written about, and almost nobody involved in making that episode seems to have expected it to survive the approval process. This entry breaks from everything covered so far in this video, because the character at its center was never invented by the show's writers at all. He was invented by an anonymous stranger on the internet, built entirely out of fear and internet folklore, and the show only noticed him after he had already spent years terrifying children who searched for the wrong thing online. The story begins not with SpongeBob at all, but with a piece of internet writing published in 2010 under the title Squidward's Suicide, sometimes referred to by fans as Red Mist. The story is told from the perspective of someone claiming to have worked as an unpaid intern at a television studio in 2005, present in an editing room the day the crew gathered to review what was supposed to be an upcoming new episode. According to the narrator, the internship came with no pay at all, since most internships in that industry rarely do, but it carried a kind of prestige among people the narrator's own age, something that would have meant very little to most adults, but felt like an enormous privilege to someone still working toward a degree in animation. Because the narrator worked directly alongside the editors and sound engineers finishing episodes for broadcast, the story claims he was able to view finished episodes days ahead of their actual air date, a privilege the story treats as unremarkable and routine. According to the story, animators on the show had a habit of putting joke title cards on unfinished episodes before the real titles were locked in, an inside joke among the crew that nobody outside the studio would ever normally see, with the story specifically citing an invented example of a lewd fake title once used to disguise a real episode about SpongeBob and Patrick adopting a sea scallop. On this particular day, the title card reads Squidward's Suicide, and the interns in the room assume it is exactly that kind of inside joke, nothing more, with one intern in the story even letting out a short laugh at what he assumes is simply a dark, unserious placeholder placeholder title. The story describes the footage that follows as starting out completely ordinary, Squidward practicing his clarinet, hitting the same kind of sour notes viewers of the actual show would recognize as a running joke, SpongeBob laughing outside his window before being told to quiet down ahead of a concert. Then, according to the narrator, small details start to feel wrong almost immediately once the footage reaches Squidward's actual performance. A handful of animation frames repeat themselves during the clarinet playing, while the audio somehow stays perfectly in sync regardless, something the narrator insists should be technically impossible given how the studio's sound was normally married to picture. The audience booing Squidward during the performance carries a tone of real malice rather than the show's usual cartoonish jeering, described in the story as unmistakably different from the ordinary kind of booing familiar to anyone who has watched more than a few episodes. The eyes of the crowd, including SpongeBob's own, appear rendered with a level of hyper-realistic detail the narrator insists does not match the show's normal animation style at all, closer to something real than anything computer-generated, with the crowd's pupils described as an unnatural red. The story escalates from there into territory that has since become somewhat notorious within the specific internet subculture that produces and shares this kind of writing. The narrator describes Squidward retreating to his bedroom and sobbing in a way that no longer sounds like the character's usual voice at all, closer, in the story's words, to something disturbingly genuine, as though the studio's own speakers had somehow become a conduit for something never meant to be broadcast through them. The camera is described as slowly zooming in on his face across a stretch of time so gradual that the movement only becomes noticeable if two frames taken 10 seconds apart are compared side by side. While beneath the sound of Squidward's crying and a rising storm-like wind, the narrator claims something like laughter can be heard at irregular intervals, never lasting long enough to properly identify. When the frame finally cuts back to Squidward's face directly, the story claims his eyes have become the same unnatural red as the crowd's, with something resembling blood beginning to run down his cheeks, rendered, according to the narrator, with a level of realism the story insists looked as though it would leave a physical stain if a viewer reached out and touched the screen. From there, the story pushes further into content built around disturbing still images the narrator claims were spliced directly into individual frames of the cartoon, content involving violence toward children, before arriving at the ending implied by the title itself, in which Squidward is shown taking his own life on screen with a firearm. None of that story is true, and it was never presented as anything other than fiction on the platforms where it actually spread, having reportedly first appeared on an anonymous internet forum before being reposted and expanded across the specific corner of the internet built around this kind of writing. It falls into a specific, well-recognized category of internet horror composition, sometimes called lost episode creepypasta, a genre built around the premise of a narrator stumbling across a disturbing, unauthorized version of a familiar piece of children's media that was never meant to be seen by the public. Squidward's suicide is widely credited within that genre as one of its most influential and most imitated examples, popular enough that it spawned a wave of copycat stories built around other cartoons using the exact same basic structure: narrator stumbling into a production environment, discovering a corrupted or unauthorized cut of a familiar show, describing a slow accumulation of wrongness building towards some final horrifying reveal. The story is frequently cited as the piece of writing that popularized the specific descriptive term hyper-realistic within this entire genre, a phrase that went on to be reused, and according to some critics badly overused, across a huge number of imitators that followed it. That wave of imitation eventually became large enough and consistent enough in quality that some of the internet forums where these stories were originally collected and shared chose to ban new lost episode submissions outright, a decision made specifically because so many low-quality copies had flooded in behind the original that the format had, according to critics within that same community, become something of a running joke rather than a genuine source of unease. Critical readers who have picked apart the original story in detail over the years have pointed to a long list of problems with its basic premise that undercut its credibility even within its own fictional framing. The narrator claims to have worked at a specific real studio building in 2005, but by that point in actual history, that particular physical studio was already in the process of winding down its television production operations, and the animated series in question was never actually produced there in the first place, having been made instead at a separate production studio located elsewhere in Los Angeles, dedicated specifically to the network's animated content. Critics have also questioned how plausible it would be for an unpaid intern to be present at all during a final review screening of unreleased material, a task that would ordinarily fall to senior editors and executives rather than students still working toward a degree, and have pointed out that the story rushes through several of its most significant reveals without the kind of build-up that usually makes makes horror writing land with real weight, leaving some of its most disturbing content feeling less like a slow unraveling and more like a checklist of shocking images presented in quick succession purely for effect. None of those criticisms stopped the story from becoming one of the most widely read and widely referenced pieces of writing in its entire genre, discussed for years afterward on dedicated horror writing forums, reviewed and reenacted in video form by numerous online creators, and eventually spun off into an entire secondary piece of fan fiction. That expanded version, generally referred to as Red Mist, drops the original first-person framing of an anonymous intern narrator entirely, and instead retells the same basic premise in a more detached, encyclopedic style, introducing an original antagonist named Andrew Skinner as the fictional creator of the disturbing tape, along with his own fish-based fictional avatar, written with a Scottish accent. Some versions of that expanded Red Mist story reportedly circulated with an additional ending in which Squidward survives the gunshot but is left severely wounded, only for the story to abruptly swerve into an entirely different, much sillier piece of internet folklore involving a fictional Scottish salesman demanding an oddly specific amount of money before transforming into a giant lake monster, an ending most later retellings of the story have quietly dropped altogether, suggesting even within the fan community that had built up around the legend, that particular twist was viewed as breaking the tone rather than serving it. What makes this story relevant to a video about one-time SpongeBob characters is not the fictional written story itself, since no actual footage matching that description has ever existed, and the writing lives entirely outside any official version of the show. What matters is a single image that grew up alongside the story and eventually took on a life completely independent of it. As the legend spread, an altered picture began circulating alongside the text, showing Squidward's face modified to include blood-red, bloodshot eyes, and streaks running down his cheeks, styled to match the horror the written story described. That image, distinct from the text itself, became the visual shorthand for the entire legend, reproduced, shared, and reworked by fans across the internet for years, generating its own smaller subculture of horror art and video recreations built specifically around recreating that single unsettling face, including at least one dedicated segment produced by an online reviewer who has made a recurring series out of reading and reacting to creepypasta stories on camera, treating this particular entry as one of the more historically significant examples in the genre, worth revisiting years after its initial spread. For a long stretch of years, this remained purely a piece of outside fan culture, something the actual show and its creative team had no visible relationship to at all. Then, in an episode from season 12 called SpongeBob in Random Land, that changed. The episode includes a sequence where characters pass through a door into an alternate version of their own universe, a structure that gives the writers an excuse to cram in a rapid series of visual gags showing twisted, altered versions of familiar faces. Tucked into that sequence, for a matter of seconds, is a version of Squidward whose face directly echoes the fan-made legend, red eyes and all, accompanied by the same kind of scream sound effect fans had long associated with recreations of the original story. According to an account from Adam Paloian, one of the show's storyboard artists, this specific gag existed because he needed a third joke to round out that sequence and had not been confident the reference would actually survive the approval process and make it into the finished episode, a detail that suggests the reference was, from the very start, treated internally as a small risk rather than an obvious, uncontroversial addition. It did survive, and the reaction split almost immediately along generational lines. For fans who had grown up with the show and later discovered the Squidward suicide legend as older viewers revisiting old episodes with fresh eyes, the cameo read as a wink, an acknowledgement from the people who actually make the show that they were aware of the strange corner of fan culture built around one of their characters, and were willing to gently poke fun at it rather than ignore it. Some members of the creepypasta writing community reportedly took a certain amount of pride in seeing a piece of their own subculture's output acknowledged, however briefly, by the very show that inspired it, treating the cameo as a kind of validation for a specific writer's work, leaving enough of a mark on internet culture that it eventually crossed back into official media. For younger viewers watching the episode without any of that context, it was simply an unexplained, unsettling image appearing without warning in the middle of an otherwise ordinary episode, with no way of knowing where it came from or why it looked the way it did. That gap between audiences, one laughing at an inside joke and the other encountering something disturbing without context, is exactly the kind of tension that tends to draw scrutiny once enough people notice it. The scrutiny arrived, and the outcome tells its own story about how far the network was willing to let this particular joke stand once attention turned toward it. According to reporting on the episode's history, the cameo was removed from later airings and re-releases of the episode starting sometime after November of 2019, pulled from the version most audiences would encounter going forward. The specific reasoning behind that decision has not been laid out in detail in any official statement from the network, but the timing lines up closely with the moment the reference started attracting broader media coverage and discussion outside the immediate fan community that had been tracking the legend for years, suggesting the network reconsidered how comfortable it was letting a joke built around a suicide-themed piece of horror fiction remain permanently attached to a children's show, once that connection started reaching an audience well beyond the older fans who understood the reference in the spirit it was originally intended. This puts the Red Mist cameo in an unusual category all its own within this entire video. Every other character covered so far started as an intentional creative decision fully owned by the show from the beginning, built to last exactly as long as the writers wanted it to last. This one began as something the show had no control over whatsoever, a piece of fan-made horror mythology built entirely outside any official channel that eventually crossed back into the show itself for a brief, deliberate cameo, only to be quietly removed once that crossing drew more attention than anyone involved seems to have anticipated. In terms of screen time, the character appears for a matter of seconds and speaks no dialogue at all, making him about as close to a true blank slate as any figure in this entire video. And yet very few one-time appearances across the show's 25-year history have generated as much sustained argument and discussion among fans as those few silent seconds have. It is worth pausing on why a legend like this took hold in the first place, separate from the show's eventual response to it. Part of what makes lost episode stories like this one effective, even when they are badly written or riddled with factual holes, is that they exploit a very specific, very real anxiety that existed long before the internet made it easy to manufacture. The idea that something familiar and safe from childhood might secretly be hiding something wrong underneath, glimpsed only by people who were never supposed to see it. That anxiety does not require good writing to work, which is part of why a story built on premises that fall apart under any real scrutiny was still able to spread as widely and as durably as it did, and why the single altered image tied to it managed to outlive the original written story so thoroughly that most people who now recognize the face have likely never read the text that first inspired it. It is also worth remembering that this show has, on at least one other occasion covered earlier in this video, deliberately built a genuinely acclaimed episode around real horror imagery borrowed from far outside its own walls, suggesting the writers themselves have always understood, on some level, how effectively unexpected horror can land inside a show built primarily around comedy. Even if the Nosferatu cameo from Graveyard Shift and the Red Mist cameo from SpongeBob in Random Land ultimately took very different paths once the public reacted to each of them. Since this section deals with a piece of writing built specifically around the subject of suicide, it is worth being clear that everything described here belongs entirely to the realm of internet fiction and fan legend, none of it based on any real event, and no version of the actual episode described in that original story has ever existed in any form. If any of this touches on something difficult for you personally, it can help to talk to someone you trust or a mental health professional about it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A face built entirely by internet strangers found its way into an actual episode for a few silent seconds before quietly disappearing again once the wrong audience noticed it. Next comes a character built the opposite way, entirely wholesome, entirely official, and famous for exactly one word of dialogue that turned into a real-world catchphrase repeated for decades. Section 8. Chocolate. Most characters in this video earned their place through a deliberate choice somebody made, a specific voice hired, a specific historical image lifted, a specific joke built with care. This one earned his entirely by accident, and he does not even carry an official name inside the show's own internal documentation, the kind every other figure in this video has had attached to them somewhere in a credit list or a production note. He became, for a very specific slice of internet culture stretching back more than 2 decades, one of the single most recognizable faces the show ever produced, built almost entirely around one repeated word screamed with escalating, unhinged intensity. The episode responsible is called Chocolate with Nuts, and it first aired on June 1st, 2002, as part of the show's 3rd season. The premise starts with SpongeBob and Patrick deciding, somewhat inexplicably, that they want to earn enough money to become what the episode calls entrepreneurs, a deliberately mangled version of the word entrepreneurs that sets the tone for the entire episode's approach to business and honesty. Rather than choosing any ordinary product to sell, the pair settles on chocolate bars, and rather than selling them honestly, they immediately begin going door to door, making increasingly absurd and dishonest claims about what the chocolate will actually do for the people buying it. To a bald fish, SpongeBob promises the chocolate will make his hair grow, prompting the man to buy enough to help his wife grow a beard. To another customer, Patrick promises the chocolate chocolate will keep his face from getting any uglier. The lies escalate further still, with promises that the chocolate will let the buyer fly, fall in love, walk through walls, achieve world peace, and eventually rule the world outright, each claim more openly ridiculous than the last, sold with total confidence to buyers who apparently do not think to question any of it. Into this chaotic, dishonest sales spree walks the character who would eventually eclipse almost everything else in the episode in terms of pure internet longevity. He is not introduced with any particular fanfare. He is simply another fish answering his door to two young salesmen, one of dozens of background citizens the show's animators had already reused across earlier episodes without ever giving him any specific identity beyond a production number. When SpongeBob and Patrick begin their pitch, mentioning chocolate almost as an afterthought within a longer sales routine, the fish's entire demeanor shifts instantly and completely. He repeats the word back to them first as a hushed, almost reverent question, asking whether they really said chocolate, and from there the scene abandons any pretense of a normal conversation entirely. The word chocolate erupts out of him again and again, louder and more unhinged each time, his eyes bulging, his mouth stretching open far wider than the show's character designs typically allow, building into a screaming, single-word obsession that completely derails the rest of the episode's plot for several minutes at a stretch. SpongeBob and Patrick, understandably alarmed by a reaction this disproportionate to a simple candy bar, panic and flee, and what follows is an extended chase sequence that runs through a large portion of the episode's remaining runtime, the two salesmen desperately trying to escape a fish whose behavior has become so erratic and so intensely focused on a single word that it stops reading as an ordinary background gag and starts reading as something closer to a genuine horror beat dropped into the middle of a comedy about door-to-door sales fraud. The chase eventually resolves in a way that reframes everything that came before it. Once he finally catches the two boys, the fish's demeanor snaps back to something calm and ordinary almost instantly, and he reveals, in a completely normal voice, that his entire frantic pursuit across the episode had a mundane explanation the whole time. He simply wanted to buy every single chocolate bar SpongeBob and Patrick had left, and produces a large pile of cash to do exactly that. An anticlimax that undercuts the horror movie intensity of everything leading up to it in one clean stroke. The same basic structural trick this show has used elsewhere in its history to build tension purely so it can deflate it with a joke. The character has no consistent official name inside the show's own internal documentation in the way many of the other figures in this video do. Production records and cast credits generally identify him simply as an incidental character, one among a large recurring pool of background citizens the animation team built early in the show's run and then reused across hundreds of episodes in different roles, different clothing, and occasionally different colors. A common cost-saving practice in television animation that allows a relatively small library of base character models to populate an enormous number of crowd scenes and minor speaking roles without requiring an entirely new design every time a new face is needed. This particular design started life not as anything unique built for the chocolate scene at all, but as a model whose visual template was actually drawn from an earlier, unrelated customer character seen in a different episode focused on a food delivery mishap. One more example of how thoroughly this show's early production leaned on recycling existing artwork wherever it reasonably could, rather than commissioning fresh designs for every single citizen who happened to wander into frame. Within that internal system, this particular incidental has been tracked by fans under a specific catalog number and has picked up several informal names across different pieces of licensed merchandise and video game credits over the years, though the name that has stuck most consistently in general use traces back to an earlier episode where he was given a spoken name in dialogue completely unrelated to the chocolate scene that would eventually define him in the public imagination. What turned this fairly ordinary piece of background animation into a genuine, sustained meme has almost nothing to do with the character's design and almost everything to do with the specific performance behind it and the specific way the scene was cut together for maximum comedic escalation. The character is voiced, like a huge number of the show's incidental and background roles, by Tom Kenny, the same performer responsible for SpongeBob's own voice, meaning the same actor is technically screaming across from himself in the scene, playing both the panicked hero fleeing the joke and the deranged pursuer chasing him. That detail rarely comes up in the meme culture that grew up around the moment, since almost none of the audience discovering this clip years later through compilation videos and reaction posts had any reason to think about who was actually performing which voice. But it is a small, quietly impressive piece of vocal range packed into a scene most viewers experience purely as pure chaos. It is worth noting just how demanding that kind of doubling up actually is for a voice performer working on a tight studio schedule, since Kenny is required within the same handful of lines to shift from SpongeBob's familiar, high-pitched panic to an entirely different register built around escalating, guttural, almost feral repetition, without either voice bleeding into the other in a way that would break the illusion that two separate characters are on screen together. The meme's spread followed a fairly predictable but well-documented path once early internet video culture developed the tools to make spreading a short clip like this one easy. Within a few years of the episode's original broadcast, once platforms built specifically around user-uploaded video and simple Flash-based animation editing had become widely accessible, the chocolate scream became a recurring building block across several distinct waves of internet remix culture. It shows up repeatedly in a genre of video editing sometimes called YouTube poop, a style built around chopping up and rearranging clips from children's television and other media into absurdist, often intentionally jarring new sequences, where a scream this intense and this repetitive made for obvious raw material. It was combined with audio and visual elements from entirely unrelated media franchises, including at least one widely circulated combination, pairing the character with the voice communication system from a well-known stealth video game series, stitched together purely because the tonal mismatch between a tactical military briefing and a fish screaming about chocolate produced its own specific kind of comedy. Separately, the clip was edited into footage from an entirely unrelated war film depicting a chaotic camp attack, inserted at the exact moment a character on screen hands chocolate to a young girl, again leaning entirely on the absurd mismatch between violent, serious footage and a single screaming word lifted from a children's cartoon. None of that spread required any involvement, acknowledgement, or promotion from the network that owned the actual show, and it happened almost entirely through the same kind of grassroots, decentralized meme culture that shaped the internet's relationship with a huge amount of early 2000s television and film footage during that particular era, well before major platforms had built out anything resembling the kind of official licensing or content moderation systems that exist today. Clips like this one traveled largely through direct file sharing, small community forums, and early video hosting sites that had far looser copyright enforcement than anything that exists now, which is part of why a meme like this one was able to take root, mutate across dozens of unrelated remixes, and settle into the internet's collective memory so thoroughly before any larger media company had built the infrastructure to meaningfully track or restrict that kind of grassroots reuse of its footage. The character eventually accumulated enough of a following that die-hard collectors of the show's merchandise have commissioned physical figures built specifically to recreate his exact screaming expression from the episode, marketed openly to fans as a piece of nostalgia built around one specific meme rather than around the character's minimal, largely undocumented role within the broader show itself. Multiple dedicated meme generator tools built for quickly overlaying custom text onto popular internet images have hosted templates built directly from this exact scene for years, allowing anyone to drop their own captions onto that same wide-open, screaming mouth long after the original clip's biggest wave of popularity had already crested and faded into a kind of permanent, low-level cultural background noise rather than an active trending topic. It is worth pointing out that this particular incidental character did not stop his career at a single scream, even if that is the role he is remembered for almost universally. According to records fans have compiled tracking every appearance of this specific background model across the show's run, he shows up again and again in wildly different contexts across the following 2 decades. Cast in one episode as SpongeBob's own dentist, appearing elsewhere as a patron in the crowd, cheering on the recurring superhero duo Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy during one of their many guest appearances at the Krusty Krab, and turning up in a completely separate later episode, reacting with a specific, exaggerated facial expression to something SpongeBob does with a drink, an expression that would go on to generate its own smaller, entirely separate meme years later among fans who track this specific background model closely enough to recognize him on sight, regardless of what role he happens to be playing in any given scene. That second meme, built around a single suspicious, unimpressed facial expression rather than a scream, developed its own life online as a reaction image used to represent the specific feeling of encountering something that has clearly been reposted from somewhere else in slightly better quality than wherever you originally saw it. A very particular and very modern kind of internet-specific joke that has nothing at all to do with chocolate, candy, or the original episode that made this character famous in the first place. That same episode also produced a smaller, closely related meme built around this character reacting with alarm to the idea that something might have been done to his drink without his knowledge. A fragment of dialogue that circulated on its own for a period as a kind of stock reaction clip, entirely separate from either the chocolate scream or the repost expression, which means this one recycled background model, drawn originally for an entirely different, forgettable delivery-driven episode, ended up quietly responsible for at least 3 separate, independently circulating memes across 3 unrelated appearances, spread out over more than a decade of the show's run. There is a specific kind of irony sitting at the center of this character's entire cultural footprint that separates him from almost every other figure discussed in this video so far. Every other one-time or effectively one-time character examined across this video was built by the show's writers with real intention behind the specific joke or reference they were meant to deliver, whether that meant borrowing a real film critic's actual voice, lifting archival footage from a genuine piece of silent horror cinema, or casting a well-known dramatic actor specifically because of the menace his existing career already carried. This character was never built with anything like that level of intention at all. He began life as one interchangeable face among a large, reusable pool of background citizens with no unique design elements and no specific backstory attached, deployed across this particular episode purely to deliver a single joke about a chase built around a comically disproportionate reaction to candy. The show's writers had no way of knowing, and likely never suspected, that this particular 5-minute chase sequence, built around a character who does not even carry a consistent official name inside the show's own records, would end up outliving entire storylines built around characters the writers clearly intended to matter far more, purely because a wide-open mouth screaming a single word turned out to be exactly the kind of raw material early internet remix culture was built to seize on and repeat forever. That gap between how little deliberate thought the show's own production put into this character and how enormous his eventual cultural footprint turned out to be sits as a kind of quiet counterpoint to everything else covered in this video up to this point. Smitty Werben Jensen grew into a meme built around a throwaway lie that accidentally turned out to be true within the show's own fictional logic. This character grew into a meme built around nothing more than a background extra's reaction shot, stretched and repeated by strangers online who had no access to, and likely no interest in, anything about who he technically was inside the show's own internal continuity. Both outcomes prove the same basic point from 2 completely different directions. Sometimes a character's lasting cultural weight has almost nothing to do with how much the people who created him actually intended for him to matter, and everything to do with what an audience, working entirely on its own, decides to do with him once he is out in the world, repeating him, remixing him, and eventually forgetting almost everything about where he actually came from except the single sound he made. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A background extra with no real name and no real backstory became one of the show's most reproduced faces purely because of one screamed word and the internet's appetite for repeating it. Next comes a character built from the opposite instinct entirely, a quiet, background pirate crew whose one appearance has left fans arguing for years about exactly what kind of business they were actually running. Section 9. The Bomb Pirates of Dying for Pie. A handful of unnamed background figures, on screen for barely a minute combined, can sometimes leave behind more unanswered questions than a character given an entire episode to explain himself. That is the case with a small crew of pirates who show up at the very beginning of an episode called Dying for Pie, sell a piece of dangerous merchandise to one of the show's main characters, and then vanish from the story completely, leaving behind a plot that only works because nobody in it ever asks the obvious follow-up question. Dying for Pie aired on January 27, 2001, as part of the show's 2nd season, and it is built around a premise that starts small and completely mundane before spiraling into one of the more memorable extended jokes in the entire series. The Krusty Krab is celebrating something called Employee Brotherhood Day, and as part of the occasion, SpongeBob presents Squidward with a handmade gift, a sweater knitted entirely out of his own eyelashes. Squidward, never one to hide his distaste for anything SpongeBob does, rejects the gift outright, calling it too itchy, which only prompts SpongeBob to make him a second sweater, this one knitted from his own tears after the first rejection leaves him crying. Mr. Krabs insists that Squidward reciprocate the gesture with something of his own, and Squidward, with zero interest in actually making anything by hand, wonders aloud why he cannot simply buy a gift instead of crafting one. That question is answered almost immediately by the sight outside the restaurant of a small crew of pirates loading what look like ordinary pies onto their ship. Squidward approaches them, comments that the pies look good, and is told directly, without any hesitation or subtlety, that they are not pies at all. They are bombs, manufactured, according to the pirates themselves, in an actual bomb factory. Squidward's reaction to hearing this information is not fear or caution. It is mild disappointment, since he had been hoping to purchase one purely as an easy solution to his gift problem. That reaction alone is enough to make the pirate captain reverse course instantly, jumping down from the ship to insist that the entire bomb comment was simply a joke, and offering offering to sell Squidward one of the pies for $25. Squidward, apparently satisfied with that explanation, despite having been told directly and unambiguously only seconds earlier that the product was explosive, hands over the money without further question. The consequences of that decision arrive almost immediately once the pie reaches the Krusty Krab. Mr. Krabs, wanting to inspect the gift before it gets passed along to SpongeBob, breaks off a small piece of crust to examine it, and in the process of turning to grab a carton of milk, trips and drops the fragment, triggering an explosion that blows a hole clean through the back wall of his office and sends both him and Squidward flying outside. It is at that exact moment that the truth the pirates had openly stated moments earlier and Squidward had chosen to overlook becomes impossible to ignore. The pie really was a bomb, precisely as advertised. When the two men rush back inside, expecting to deal with the wreckage, they discover the pie itself is missing entirely, and the culprit turns out to be SpongeBob, who has arrived, found the gift sitting unattended, and appears to have eaten the entire thing, thanking Squidward warmly for such a thoughtful present in the process. From that single misunderstanding, the episode builds one of the show's most quietly effective emotional arcs, largely carried by the deadpan seriousness of Mr. Krabs' response to the crisis. Krabs, drawing on some unspecified history that the episode never fully explains, states with total confidence that he has personally witnessed this exact scenario play out 11 separate times before, and that the bomb will detonate once it reaches SpongeBob's lower intestine, an event he calculates will occur right around sunset. With no way to safely remove the bomb, and no way to warn SpongeBob about his own impending death without ruining whatever time he has left, Squidward, racked with guilt over having caused the situation in the first place, commits to spending the rest of the day making sure SpongeBob's final hours are as fun and memorable as possible, working through an entire handwritten list of activities SpongeBob has apparently been keeping for exactly this kind of open-ended, wish-fulfilling day. The rest of the episode plays out as an increasingly absurd montage of activities forced onto a visibly reluctant Squidward, building toward a tense final sequence in which Squidward, terrified of the coming explosion, constructs an entire brick wall between himself and SpongeBob before nervously counting down the setting sun. The eventual reveal undercuts almost the entire emotional weight of everything that came before it in a single stroke. When the sun finally sets and an explosion does occur, it turns out to be nothing more than a large soap bubble SpongeBob has blown into the shape of a bomb purely for fun, and SpongeBob reveals, completely unbothered, that he never actually ate the real pie at all. He had been carrying it in his pocket the entire day, intending to save it so the two of them could share it together once Squidward's imagined ordeal was over. The genuine bomb, still fully intact and still fully explosive, is produced on the spot, at which point SpongeBob trips over a small rock while offering to finally eat it together, sending the pie flying directly into Squidward's face and triggering a blast large enough, according to the episode's own visual staging, to level a significant portion of Bikini Bottom around them. Squidward, somehow surviving an explosion of that scale with barely a scratch, offers only a single flat word in response: "Ow." The most striking piece of craftsmanship buried inside that final explosion has nothing to do with animation at all. According to details fans have traced about the episode's production, the visual footage used for the blast itself is not an original animated sequence created for the show, but real archival footage taken from an actual historical event, the Baker detonation from Operation Crossroads, a series of nuclear weapons tests conducted by the United States military in 1946. That detonation took place at Bikini Atoll, the real-world Pacific location that gave this entire fictional underwater town its name in the first place, meaning the show quietly closed one of its most beloved comedic episodes by inserting genuine footage of an actual nuclear test conducted at the real geographic location the entire series has always been built around, a detail most viewers, understandably, would have no reason to recognize while simply enjoying the joke of Squidward getting hit in the face with a pie. None of that context changes the fact that the pirates responsible for setting the entire plot in motion never appear again after that opening scene, and their absence has fueled a specific, ongoing strand of fan discussion that has never fully resolved itself, precisely because the episode itself never bothers to resolve it either. The most basic unanswered question sits right at the center of their entire scene. If the pirates knew from the very beginning, and stated outright without any hesitation, that the pies they were selling were genuinely explosive weapons capable of leveling a city, why would they sell one to a customer purely for a quick $25 with no apparent plan, motive, or benefit beyond the immediate cash in hand? The episode offers no larger context for who these pirates are, what their actual business model is meant to be, or whether selling deadly ordnance disguised as baked goods to unsuspecting customers is a one-time scheme cooked up on the spot or a regular, ongoing operation. Mr. Krabs' own comment comment about having witnessed this exact situation occur 11 times before implies, without ever confirming outright, that this may not be an isolated incident at all, and that some version of this exact transaction, a customer unknowingly buying an explosive disguised as food, may have happened repeatedly enough over time that Krabs has developed something close to a personal system for predicting exactly when the resulting bomb will detonate inside a victim's body, a detail that raises far more questions about the general safety conditions of Bikini Bottom than the episode has any interest in actually answering. Fans picking apart the scene have also focused heavily on the pirate captain's own behavior in the moment Squidward reveals he wants to buy one of the bombs. Having just told Squidward plainly and without any apparent deception that the pies are weapons manufactured in an actual bomb factory, the captain immediately reverses that statement the instant he sees an opportunity for a sale, insisting the entire bomb comment was simply a joke, a claim Squidward accepts without any real scrutiny, despite having heard the original, unambiguous warning only seconds earlier. Whether Squidward genuinely believed the retraction, or simply chose not to think too hard about it because buying a finished gift was easier than making one himself, remains something the episode leaves entirely open to interpretation, and it is a question that has generated its own small back and forth among fans over the years. Some reading Squidward's later insistence to SpongeBob that he had no idea the pie was a bomb as a sign he truly did fall for the pirate's reversal, others reading that same insistence as a convenient excuse offered after the fact by a character who understood exactly what he was buying and simply wanted Mr. Krabs off his back about the gift as quickly as possible. There is also the matter of accountability, or the complete lack of it, which fans have pointed to as one of the stranger loose threads left dangling once the episode's plot resolves. By any reasonable measure, the pirates responsible for selling a functioning explosive device disguised as a baked good, resulting in significant property damage and very nearly the death of one of the town's main citizens, should face some kind of consequence once the truth comes out. The episode delivers none. The pirates are never seen again after their opening scene, never confronted, never punished, and never even mentioned again by any of the characters who directly suffered the consequences of their sale. Whatever business they are actually running, whether it involves genuine confusion about pie versus bomb inventory, a knowing scheme built around exploiting customers willing to overlook an obvious warning for a bargain price, or something else the show has simply chosen never to explain, it apparently continues entirely unaffected and unpunished, somewhere just outside the edges of the story the episode actually chose to tell. What makes this particular group of one-time characters worth including in this video is not any single joke or any specific piece of dialogue the way earlier entries have been built around a name or a scream or a borrowed piece of real-world history. It is the sheer, deliberate incompleteness of their role in the plot. A group of background figures given just enough dialogue to set an entire episode's emotional core in motion, and just little enough explanation to leave a permanent, unresolved gap that fans have kept poking at for over 2 decades since the episode first aired. Dying for Pie itself has aged into one of the most consistently praised entries in the show's entire catalog, ranked in some retrospective countdowns among the very best episodes the franchise ever produced, built almost entirely around the emotional tension of Squidward believing, even briefly and even reluctantly, that he has accidentally caused the death of someone he spends most of his time pretending not to care about at all. None of that emotional weight would exist without a handful of pirates who appear for less than a minute, sell a bomb disguised as a pie without a hint of guilt, and disappear from the story forever, leaving behind a question the show never intended to answer and fans have never quite stopped asking anyway. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A handful of unnamed pirates set an entire beloved episode into motion and vanished without a single consequence, leaving behind a mystery the show never meant to be a mystery at all. This brings the count to 9 one-time characters covered across this video, and the 10th and final entry closes things out with a character who never speaks, never moves, and still manages to be one of the most quietly unsettling figures Bikini Bottom ever produced. Section 10. The Cyclops. This final character appears in only one piece of official SpongeBob media. He never speaks a single word across his entire time on screen, and by the time his one story concludes, he has been revealed as something considerably darker than anything else covered in this entire video. A threat so far removed from the show's usual tone that his brief appearance is still argued over by fans today as one of the strangest choices the franchise ever made. He is known simply as the Cyclops, and he appears in the SpongeBob SquarePants movie, released in 2004, during the film's climactic stretch as SpongeBob and Patrick finally near the end of their long journey to reach Shell City and recover King Neptune's stolen crown. Up to this point in the film, the two characters have survived a string of dangers scaled specifically specifically for a family audience, each one presented with enough cartoonish exaggeration to keep the tone from ever tipping into anything genuinely frightening. They cross a trench filled with monsters played almost entirely for laughs. They face down a hitman whose menace, as covered earlier in this video, gets undercut by his own ridiculous villain gimmicks the moment he finally corners them. Every obstacle up to this point in the film follows the same basic rhythm the television show has relied on for its entire run, building tension only to release it through a joke before the tension can ever curdle into something the youngest viewers in the audience might actually carry with them after the credits roll. The Cyclops arrives at the very end of that gauntlet, and he is where the film finally, briefly, lets something colder into the story, refusing for a stretch of several minutes to offer the same kind of comedic release the rest of the film has trained its audience to expect. He is introduced visually rather than through any dialogue at all, a massive, single-eyed figure descending toward the ocean floor in diving equipment, and the film wastes very little time establishing exactly what he is there to do. There is no lengthy setup, no scene of dialogue between other characters warning SpongeBob and Patrick about what waits ahead of them, the way Squidward's ghost story in Graveyard Shift spends an entire episode building anticipation before anything actually happens. The Cyclops simply appears, already mid-task, already descending with the same quiet, business-like efficiency of someone who has done this exact job many times before and expects to do it many times again. It is revealed that this figure is not a monster or a mythical sea creature native to the world SpongeBob and Patrick live in, but something considerably more mundane and, in its own way, more disturbing. He is a human diver, enormous only because of the scale difference between human beings and the tiny sea creatures populating Bikini Bottom, and he has been capturing and killing marine life from the ocean floor in order to sell the preserved remains as souvenirs in a beachside gift shop up on the surface. It is an almost throwaway piece of world building, delivered with minimal fanfare, and yet it recontextualizes the entire threat the character poses in an instant. He is not a villain motivated by revenge or greed within the internal logic of Bikini Bottom's own economy, the way Plankton or Dennis are. He is simply doing an ordinary, if morbid job, entirely unaware that the tiny creatures he is collecting have full inner lives, families, and personalities of their own. That gap between the Cyclops' mundane, real-world motivation and the emotional stakes of the story he wanders into produces one of the more genuinely startling moments in the franchise's history. SpongeBob and Patrick, cornered and with nowhere left to run, are captured by the Cyclops, and the film does not shy away from showing the direct consequences of that capture on screen. Both characters are shown being processed, dried out, and mounted as literal souvenirs inside the very gift shop the Cyclops has been supplying, a sequence multiple critics and fans have singled out over the years as one of the most shocking moments ever allowed into a film built primarily as a light-hearted, family-friendly comedy. There is a particular flatness to how the sequence unfolds that makes it land harder than a more dramatic staging might have. Nothing about the scene is framed with the kind of swelling music or slow-motion emphasis a more conventional film might use to signal a major turning point. It plays out with almost the same tone the film uses for its jokes, quick, matter-of-fact, moving briskly from one beat to the next, which has the paradoxical effect of making the content feel even colder once a viewer actually registers what is happening, rather than simply following the pace of the editing. The sequence does not last, and the story finds a way to reverse it before the credits roll. But for the several minutes it occupies, the film treats its own two lead characters as though they have genuinely died, dried, mounted, and sold as cheap tourist merchandise, a fate considerably darker and more final than anything the show's television episodes, even at their most intentionally creepy, generally allow themselves to depict. It is worth pausing on how unusual this actually is, within the broader context of everything else covered across this video. The Nosferatu cameo, discussed several sections back, borrowed real horror imagery, but it did so entirely for comedic effect, ending on a joke rather than dwelling on any genuine sense of threat. The Tattletale Strangler was built around menace that the show immediately and repeatedly undercut, never once allowing him to actually succeed at anything resembling the violence his name promised. Dennis, similarly, spent an entire build-up establishing real stakes before being crushed by a boot bigger than his own, in a single beat clearly designed to deflate the tension rather than pay it off seriously. The Cyclops sequence does not offer that same immediate release. The horror of watching two familiar, beloved characters get dried out and shelved as souvenirs is allowed to sit, uncomfortably, for long enough that it registers as something closer to a genuine gut punch than a punchline, before the plot eventually works its way around to undoing the damage. That willingness to let a dark beat actually land, rather than immediately laughing it off, separates the Cyclops from nearly every other threat this franchise has ever put in front of its two lead characters, in either the show or its films. Structurally, the The Cyclops occupies almost exactly the same narrative role inside this film that a completely different villain played inside a very different animated feature released more than 15 years earlier. Fans who have compared the two have pointed to Judge Doom, the antagonist from the 1988 film Who Framed Roger Rabbit, as an obvious point of reference, and the parallels, once noticed, are difficult to dismiss as coincidence entirely. Both characters wear an outfit suggesting some kind of official, authoritative role. Doom dressed as a judge, the Cyclops equipped with the gear of a professional diver going about sanctioned, ordinary work. Both rely on a hidden mechanical advantage built into their footwear during their respective climactic confrontations, Doom using springs concealed in his shoes to leap unnaturally high, the Cyclops relying on the sheer disproportionate size of his own boots, one of which, in a detail already covered earlier in this video, ends up accidentally crushing the hitman Dennis moments before he can finish off SpongeBob and Patrick himself. And both villains ultimately hunt down a cartoon protagonist, defined partly by an exaggerated set of buck teeth, Roger Rabbit in Doom's case, SpongeBob in the Cyclops' case, a small design echo that seems too specific to be accidental, even without any direct statement from the filmmakers confirming the reference outright. Whether that resemblance reflects a deliberate homage on the part of the animators who worked on this film, or simply two separate creative teams reaching for a similar archetype decades apart when they needed a climactic threat dressed in an official-looking costume, remains, like several other observations made across this video, something fans have pieced together after the fact, rather than something confirmed directly by anyone who worked on the production. Unlike Dennis, unlike Nosferatu, unlike almost every other figure examined in this video, the Cyclops was never given a voice actor at all, credited or otherwise, because the character was never intended to speak. He exists purely as a physical presence and a physical threat, communicating entirely through his actions, his enormous scale relative to the film's tiny protagonists, and the single, unblinking eye that gives him his name. That total silence is not a limitation imposed on the character by budget or time constraints, the way some of the show's more minor background citizens are limited. It is a deliberate choice that makes him function almost like a force of nature within the film, rather than a character with any interior motivation the audience is ever invited to understand or sympathize with. The audience is never shown his face beneath the diving helmet, never given a name to call him beyond the simple physical descriptor the credits themselves use, and never given any indication of what he thinks or feels about the small, screaming creatures he processes into merchandise. He is simply there, doing a job, entirely oblivious to the fact that his job has, for the span of one film, become the single greatest threat two beloved cartoon characters have ever faced. There is something worth dwelling on in just how ordinary that job actually is, once it is stripped of the scale distortion the film uses to turn it into a threat. A diver collecting small sea creatures to sell as dried curiosities in a beachside gift shop is not, from a human perspective, an unusual or sinister occupation. It is the kind of low-key, slightly morbid tourist trade that exists in real coastal towns without anyone thinking twice about it. Shells and small preserved sea life sold beside postcards and sunscreen to visitors looking for a cheap souvenir. The film's entire trick is to place its audience inside the perspective of the tiny creatures on the other end of that transaction, forcing a moment of genuine unease out of an activity that would otherwise be completely unremarkable if viewed from the diver's own scale and vantage point. That inversion, taking something mundane and revealing how genuinely frightening it becomes once you shrink the observer down to the size of the thing being collected, is a trick with a long history in storytelling generally, and it is a considerably more sophisticated piece of narrative construction than most of what this franchise typically reaches for in its comedy-driven television episodes. The Cyclops has never returned in any other piece of official SpongeBob media since this one film. He exists in exactly one place, confined entirely to the climax of a single movie released in 2004, never referenced again in any of the countless television episodes, later films, or spin-off series that followed. That total absence from every subsequent piece of the franchise stands in sharp contrast to several of the other characters examined across this video, many of whom found their way back into small cameos, background appearances, or later recastings even when their one starring moment technically ended. Nosferatu became a fully recurring character, built around an entirely new design and a new voice actor. The Tattletale Strangler kept turning up in silent background cameos for years after his one starring episode. Even Kevin the Sea Cucumber, whose defining appearance belongs to a single episode, resurfaced in small roles and eventually an entire prequel spin-off. The Cyclops gets none of that. He appears, he nearly destroys everything two of the show's most beloved characters have, and then the story moves past him entirely, leaving him behind in Shell City without a single word of follow-up in over 2 decades of material produced since. A silence that feels less like an oversight and more like the character character simply having no further purpose to serve once his one job within the story is finished. That total silence and total finality is, in the end, exactly what makes him worth closing this entire video on. Every other character covered here left behind something that could be traced, argued over, or repeated. A meme built from a scream, a legend built from an altered image, a name that grew larger than the joke that created it. The Cyclops leaves behind nothing of that kind. He never speaks, he never returns, and he was never given anything resembling a personality beyond the singular, silent purpose the film assigned him. There is no catchphrase attached to him, no voice actor whose own career adds a second layer of meaning to his appearance, no piece of fan art recreating a specific expression, because he was never given an expression capable of being recreated in the first place. He is, in the most literal sense possible, a blank presence moving through one sequence of one film, defined entirely by what he does rather than by anything he says or feels. And yet, for the small handful of minutes he occupies on screen, he manages something almost none of the other one-time characters covered across 10 sections of this video ever quite achieve. He makes the ocean floor feel, if only for a moment, like a genuinely dangerous place to be small in, a reminder tucked into the margins of one of the most beloved family films ever made, that somewhere above the cheerful, familiar water of Bikini Bottom, something much larger, much quieter, and much less interested in anyone's feelings is always capable of reaching down. Every other character in this video needed a name, a voice, a joke, or a piece of internet culture to earn a lasting place in the memory of anyone who watched them. The Cyclops needed none of that. He needed only a single silent descent through open water, and an entire generation of viewers old enough to notice what was actually happening on screen has never quite forgotten him since.
If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.